What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto was the last male Uzumaki and every Kunoichi wanted his bloodline? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. Konoha was a village based on order. Originally founded amidst the chaos of the warring clans era, it was conceived as a refuge from the constant uncertainty that plagued the ninja of that time. It was created in stages. At first nothing more than an area commonly occupied by the Senju and Uchiha clans, then a fortified town that drew more clans from the surrounding area, and finally a bustling village with both shinobi and civilian aspects. As shinobi from multiple clans came together, the need for a formalized ranking system to measure their relative skills was realized. It was relatively simple. Genin at the bottom, then Chunin, the Jonin, then Kage at the top. From the ranks of Chunin and Jonin, the Anbu chose the most promising, forming their elite core for the good of the village. It could be said, therefore, that an Anbu Jonin was the best of the best, a shinobi honed into the most refined weapon possible. Currently, 2 of these refined weapons were being outwitted by a 5-year-old. It's been almost 3 months. Kat complained. It was raining again, and she liked being wet no more than her namesake. 3 months of searching Konoha from top to bottom. How do we even know he's still out here? Inu simply shrugged and replied, "You heard the Hokage. He was still here when Kumo tried to kidnap the Hyuga heiress. If he'd hung around that long, there's no reason to suspect that he's moved on. These forests provide him with food, water, and shelter if that cubby hole we found is anything to go by." They'd found the little hideaway 2 weeks into their search by sheer chance, when Inu had noticed a series of marks in the bark of the tree from Naruto's chains. Why leave when you have everything you need? Kat huffed at him. That's another thing. That damn cubby was almost 50 feet up in the air. We can't search the entire forest up and down every tree. Hell, the entire Anbu couldn't do that in 30 years. It wasn't that Inu couldn't understand her frustration. He, too, wished that they could just find the boy and get back to more important things. A small part of him, however, was impressed at how thoroughly the boy had managed to evade 2 trained Anbu. If he was this good at stealth now, how would he be with some decent training? It was a scary thought. Well, we know he's not here, so that's a start. And we don't have to search every tree from top to bottom, just look for the marks on the lowest branches like last time. We'll find him eventually. He motioned, and they moved towards the next search grid. 15 down, 200 more to go. High in the trees above them, Naruto smiled to himself. It was irritating on some level to have to hide from 2 active seekers in what he considered his home, but the constant evasion was keeping his mind occupied and his senses sharp. At first he'd stayed as far away from the 2 as possible, keeping to the higher parts of the treetops to avoid being seen. As days turned to weeks and, eventually, months, Naruto turned it into a sort of game. He would follow them around, getting closer and closer, seeing how close he could get before they noticed him. A few times it had seemed like they'd sensed his presence, but so far he'd managed to reel himself back and avoid discovery through either skill or luck. His true lucky break, however, had been overhearing a conversation between the 2 about how they'd found his previous home. He'd never thought about the marks his chains caused, nor how they could be used to track him down. Ever since that day he'd religiously avoided using the lower branches as anchor points, and kept to the canopy as much as possible. He knew that, fast though he was, he'd never be able to outrun trained shinobi if they found his trail, so he was careful not to leave marks where they could be seen from the ground. It meant a little more effort to extend his chains higher, but the practice was good for him and the safety was worth it. While his game of hide and seek was an entertaining pastime, Naruto had begun to spend less and less time in the deeper parts of the forest, instead choosing to spend the majority of his free time observing the practice fields used by Konoha's shinobi. What had started out as a way to pass the time had quickly morphed into an obsession after he had stumbled across a ninja practicing fire jutsu. Watching a seemingly ordinary human breathe fire or sink into the earth like a mole was endlessly fascinating to watch, even if Naruto had no idea how it was done. While he had not, as of yet, figured out how the hand movements were connected to the jutsu's final results, he could watch them practice with their weapons and taijutsu stances and try to mimic them. It took Naruto less than 15 minutes to get to the training ground from where he'd been watching Kat and Inu, and though it was still hours before midday he could see that the boy had already been training for some time. As he settled down on a medium-height branch, He watched the boy attempt something new. As he watched, the boy's form seemed to waver slightly, growing indistinct and distorted. This continued for several seconds, until the boy's body dissolved into a number of crows that scattered around the clearing. For a moment Naruto was shocked, frantically looking around and wondering if the boy was all right. He let out a small breath of relief as the boy reappeared in the clearing not far from where he disappeared in a flock of crows, now panting slightly. After a moment he straightened, wiping sweat from above his forehead protector, and took a stance. Naruto leaned forward slightly, excited to see what he would do next. The boy made the same flicking motion with his hand Naruto had come to recognize over the last 3 weeks, and kunai blurred away from him. Unfortunately for Naruto, it was only as the kunai slammed into the tree bark an inch to the right of his head that he noticed the boy was no longer standing in the field. He froze, and was about to bolt when he felt something cold and sharp against his neck. "I have some questions for you," came an emotionless voice from behind him, "and I think it's in your best interests to answer them truthfully." Uchiha Itachi was never the most sociable person. A pacifist by nature, he had been pressured by his family to live up to his status as the heir to a ninja family for his entire life, and had withdrawn from others when it became obvious that they did not share his aversion to violence. The Uchiha were the best, his family maintained, and therefore above petty things like worrying about the damage you caused your opponent or how your actions would influence others' lives. After all, if they weren't Uchiha, why did they matter? Except they did, to Itachi, and this made any interaction with his family complicated. Training had been an escape for him, his rising skill used as a deterrent so that he didn't have to participate in the violence he so abhorred. Despite his fearsome reputation, he hadn't had to kill anyone on a mission in almost 2 years, preferring to simply avoid bloodshed if possible, and attack to incapacitate if forced. Inside the Uchiha compound, his reputation managed to keep him from being challenged, but had furthered his isolation until there was really only 2 Uchiha who looked at him as a person and not a weapon. Combine this with his naturally quiet demeanor, and Itachi became the kind of living ghost that most people avoided, a silent warrior that made people uncomfortable just by existing in their vicinity. Itachi, true to his nature, had chosen a training ground far away from the normal bustle of the village where he could keep to himself and hone his skills away from the fearful eyes of the villagers. His training grounds had served him well, as his recent appointment to the Anbu Corps could attest, and he constantly pushed himself. Out here he could forget all the disagreements with the clan, the awe-filled gazes of the villagers, and simply concentrate on the joy of honing a skill to perfection, on overcoming a challenge and becoming stronger for the achievement. So it had confused him greatly when, starting a week and a half ago, he no longer felt the normal serenity that made his isolated training grounds so important to his state of mind. Confused, he'd pushed himself harder and harder, hoping it was simply a passing feeling, but it had persisted through everything, making him uneasy in what had been a sanctuary. Finally he had forced himself to look at the problem from another angle. As far as he knew, there had been no change in him, and if he hadn't changed then his surroundings had. Since his main reason for being all the way out in the woods was solitude, it followed that an intruder would cause his uneasiness. Itachi's plan to catch the intruder was simple. Wait until he began to feel uncomfortable in the training field, then use an area-wide genjutsu and see if anyone reacted to it. As he'd cast the technique, he heard a slight sound of surprise coming from one of the trees that surrounded the training ground. A quick look with his Sharingan activated had allowed him to make out the chakra network of a hidden figure. Not reacting to the presence, he'd taken his stance, and flung several kunai out in a deflection pattern. As soon as the last blade left his hand, he'd quickly shinned behind the figure, reflexively pointing a kunai at the carotid. He was surprised at how small the figure was from behind, but ninja were rarely what they seemed and more dangerous things had come in smaller packages. "I have some questions for you," he intoned emotionlessly, "and I think it's in your best interests to answer them truthfully." And that was when everything went to hell. Itachi was a master of the Sharingan, and one of the most skilled ninja in Konoha. Chakra allowed ninja to do many amazing things, and he'd become somewhat jaded to the bizarre. But seeing several thick pointed chains burst from the small figure in front of him without any hand signs or visible chakra molding nearly shook him. The fact that those chains were nearly invisible to the Sharingan, even a fully matured one like his, pushed him over the threshold. He was too well trained to be caught flat-footed, even shocked as he was, but it was surprisingly difficult to dodge the initial explosion of chains. As each chain exploded outwards in a straight line, numerous small side chains burst from the links in even intervals. The combination of the surprising nature of the attack and the nearly invisible state of the chains forced Itachi to move back, reflexively dodging the projectiles, and stare in shock at the figure that had been spying on him for the last several weeks. His first thought was that it was an Inuzuka. He had the feral demeanor of one of the Ninken users, and his ragged appearance suggested an animalistic approach to hygiene. But closer inspection showed major differences. While the Inuzuka could rarely be bothered with niceties like repairing a worn patch on a jacket or pants, the clothes the boy was wearing were clearly past the worn stage and into complete destruction. His pants barely came below the knees, and he seemed to be wearing a short vest that was all that remained of an orange jacket. He was barefoot, and his feet had a leathery texture to them, easily gripping the rough tree bark without discomfort. But it was the face that held Itachi's attention. Long reddish blonde hair fell just above his shoulders, framing a face almost identical to one Itachi had not seen in nearly 6 years. The color is wrong, but he looks just like the Yondaime. The thought was so unexpected that Itachi nearly lost his grip on the branch he was standing on, staring at the figure as if seeing a ghost. The Yondaime had visited the academy several times during Itachi's tenure there, sometimes teaching and sometimes observing others teach. Kakashi and Kushina being the two he showed up with most often. Seeing the boy shift his weight in preparation to flee, Itachi made a quick judgment call. Taijutsu was ill-advised with those chains curving around him like the heads of a hydra, and ninjutsu would most likely cause more damage than he wanted. His decision was inevitable. He caught the boy's eyes again, startlingly blue eyes meeting red, and a quick hand sign initiated the illusion technique. Itachi watched as the boy's eyes dilated, then closed. The boy, no longer holding himself to the branch, fell downwards, but Itachi caught him easily and brought him safely to the forest floor. Itachi looked at the boy, his face unreadable. He'd rarely been presented with such a mystery. Why had the boy been spying on him? What were the chains he'd seen, and why didn't they register correctly to the Sharingan? Why did he feel as if he'd seen them somewhere before? And, most importantly, why was someone who looked eerily like the most beloved leader in Konoha's history wandering round in the forest, alone, looking more like a cave-dwelling savage than a human being? Nothing was adding up, and Itachi was beginning to suspect that the only one who could answer those questions was the boy currently unconscious on the ground next to him. As he looked up at the sky, Itachi sighed quietly. Why is it that the more I try to live a quiet life, the more fate seems to enjoy playing with me? No answer was forthcoming from the floating clouds, and Itachi looked at the boy once more. Sighing again, he sat down next to the boy to wait for him to wake up. Today was supposed to clear up the questions, not multiply them. Naruto came awake all at once, used to going from sleep to fully awake quickly from his time living in the forest. You couldn't catch food or chase off foxes sniffing around your home if you had to spend 10 minutes rubbing the sleep from your eyes, and it was a lesson he'd learned quickly. His only problem was he couldn't remember going to sleep, and this was definitely not his nice cubby hole in the tree. He only had to wonder for a second before his memory kicked back in, including his last memory of swirling red eyes. He whipped quickly to his feet, 2 chains reflexively extending from his lower back, and looked around quickly. The same boy he'd been watching for so long was seated no more than 3 or 4 yards away, staring at him. Naruto kept himself in a defensive crouch, but made sure to keep his eyes away from the boy's eyes, remembering how easily he'd been captured before. He waited for some sign that the boy would attack as he had before, but none came. He simply watched Naruto, not moving, and waited. Itachi had been surprised at how quickly the boy had gone from completely asleep to fully alert, but now he was faced with a conundrum. The boy was extremely wary of him, and unless he wanted to continually knock the boy out, those chains would make things difficult. If he wanted to get answers to any of his questions, he had to find a way of gaining the boy's trust, at least a little, and that would be difficult with someone as wary as he obviously was. He had just decided the best way was to try and talk to the boy and see if he was able to get some information when he heard the boy's stomach growl loudly. At first Itachi didn't recognize the sound, but the boy in front of him shrank lower into a crouch, and a slight blush colored his face. Itachi almost laughed out loud, and a small smile did manage to make its way onto his face. He reached back to get a ration bar out of one of the pouches on his waist, but stopped as the chains pointed toward him began to wave back and forth like snakes. Interestingly, without his Sharingan active he could see them perfectly well. Another mystery to add to the list, he thought. Moving extremely slowly so as to not startle his quarry even more, Itachi pulled a ration bar out his pack and showed it to the boy. He wasn't sure that the boy recognized it, but he wasn't running or attacking, which Itachi took as a good sign. Keeping his expression neutral, he lightly tossed the bar at the boy. Blindingly quick, one of the chains speared the bar some 4 feet away from his body, holding it there. The boy looked at it suspiciously, and a third chain snaked from behind his back to poke the bar. With surprising dexterity he sliced the wrapper from the bar and examined it closely. "It's food," Itachi said. The boy jumped slightly, and Itachi was worried he would bolt for a second. Itachi slowly brought another ration bar from the same pouch and unwrapped it, then took a bite. The boy watched him chew and swallow, then gingerly brought his captured bar up to mimic Itachi. He chewed slowly, but seemed calmer now. Itachi took another bite, and watched as the boy began to devour the bar. He doesn't look too malnourished, but nobody would let their child wander around in the forests out here, much less in clothes like that. He's obviously been on his own for a while. Itachi mused as they ate in silence. He was surprised that someone so young could survive on their own for so long, but decided the chains would be a big advantage in the forest. As they both finished their ration bars, Itachi was glad to see that instead of a defensive crouch, the boy looked more curious now. He decided that he'd probably built up a bit of goodwill with the gift of food, and spoke. "What is your name?" Itachi asked. The boy seemed confused for a second, and then croaked out, "Naruto." His voice was scratchy and hesitant, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. It further validated Itachi's theory that he'd been alone for a long time. "I'm Itachi," he introduced himself. He watched as Naruto tried to pronounce his name several times, finally seeming to grow comfortable with it. "Were you the one watching me for the last few weeks, Naruto?" Itachi watched as Naruto's face drew in on itself, and his eyes began to whip back and forth, as if looking for a path to run. "I'm not mad, Naruto, just curious," Itachi said. Naruto nodded timidly, still looking uncomfortable. "Why?" Itachi asked, genuinely curious. If he was trying so hard to remain unseen, why spend time spying on a shinobi, the one type of person most likely to notice? Naruto reached around his back, and pulled 2 worn kunai from his back pocket. Itachi went on high alert, although he was outwardly unchanged. Naruto turned toward a tree, still keeping Itachi in his field of vision, and threw the kunai, one after the other. The second kunai hit the first and threw it off course, causing it to hit a tree handle first. He was trying to learn the deflection technique. Itachi thought, shocked. The technique was difficult even for him, and widely regarded as impossible for anyone without a Sharingan. Then he managed a rudimentary deflection at his age, even if it hadn't worked correctly, was amazing. He noticed the scowl on Naruto's face, and watched as he pulled out 2 more kunai and repeated the throw. This time the deflected kunai landed point first, although it only penetrated a small way into the bark. Itachi stood, shocked. He had never thought that someone without the Sharingan would be able to manage the calculations required for a deflection, much less from simply observing someone else do the technique. He watched as Naruto used one of his chains to retrieve the fallen kunai and tucked them back into his pocket, looking more satisfied now that he'd gotten at least some success with the kunai. "Where did you learn to throw kunai like that? Did your family teach you?" Itachi asked, curious now. He immediately regretted his question when he saw Naruto draw in on himself again. He cursed at himself silently. If he was related to the Yondaime, an orphan, his family was probably dead. It was the most likely explanation for why a boy with an obvious bloodline was alone in the woods, especially in a village like Konoha that practically worshipped those with a Kekkei Genkei. Uncharacteristically ashamed of himself, he tried awkwardly to apologize. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked. I know many people who've lost their family, it's very difficult." It was even true. Death was common in the ninja world, and almost every active Konoha shinobi had lost family in the line of duty. He was surprised when Naruto looked at him sharply. "I have a family," he exclaimed. Itachi watched warily as one of the two chains hovering around Naruto began scratching at the ground. "See," Naruto said. "My family." Itachi moved slowly, and Naruto backed away slightly as he came closer. Itachi looked down to see two crude drawings in the dirt of a man and a woman standing side by side. The man was labeled Minato, and the woman, Kushina, with a small picture to the side of a boy with chains coming out of him labeled Naruto. Itachi reeled back slightly as the pieces clicked into place. He remembered where he'd seen those chains before. One of his last lectures at the academy before the Kyuubi attack had been on Kekkei Genkei and their use in the ninja world. It had included basic introductions on all of Konoha's main bloodlines, but part of the lesson had been taught by Kushina Uzumaki and focused on always being wary of unknown bloodlines. She'd emphasized the point by manifesting several chains that had quickly bound another instructor before fading. He'd only seen them for a second, and never with the Sharingan active, but he was sure of it. And if he had inherited her bloodline and his father's name was Minato with his appearance. Itachi could feel a large headache building. The most powerful ninja Konoha had produced since Hashirama Senju had had a son with one of the most skilled jonin in the village and inherited her bloodline, and nobody knew. Not only that, but he lived in the woods like a savage. "Again, I'm sorry, Naruto. I didn't mean to imply that you had no family," he said slowly. "This would require delicate handling." "Naruto, how long have you and your family been in the forest?" Itachi asked. If he could get some sort of timeline, he could begin to figure out what had led to this. Naruto frowned. "Don't know," he said, shrugging. "I was 4, it was a long time ago." If what Naruto was saying was true, he'd been in the woods for around 2 years on his own. That he'd survived at all, much less remained unseen, was an amazing feat. Now came the important question. Naruto had seemed open enough to Itachi after he'd fed him, but Itachi knew this was treading into sensitive territory. If any subject would scare him off, this would be it, but it was too important to ignore. "Why did you go into the forest, Naruto? Why not stay in Konoha?" As Itachi had feared, Naruto began to pull inward. His knees came up to his chest, and the chains wrapped around him until he seemed cocooned. Itachi was about to say something, to try and break him out of his fugue, when he heard Naruto answer. "They tried to kill me." It was almost a whisper, but the sheer amount of despair in his voice reminded Itachi of the first time he'd had to kill in combat. It was the kind of soul-deep pain that stayed with you, buried but always there. "He tried to kill me, but my chains killed him instead. So I went to the woods. I'm free there." Itachi caught the phrasing, and immediately began to piece together a possible scenario. He killed someone in self-defense with his Kekkei Genkei, and was so scared of what the village would do that he abandoned it entirely. Itachi had seen the kind of snap judgments the civilians could make. If a bloodline user was seen killing civilians, it would be bad, but why would a civilian try to kill a 4-year-old? He needed more information and a look at the village records, but he wasn't sure what to do with Naruto. He wasn't truly comfortable with sending him back into the woods by himself, even though he'd been surviving quite well out there, but until he figured out why someone with his lineage was attacked, and by whom, it wasn't safe for him to come into the village. Finally, Itachi decided that leaving Naruto to live on his own as he had been was the lesser of two evils, and less likely to get him hurt. He turned to Naruto, moving to within a meter or so of the boy. He was wary of coming closer due to the chains, and was relieved when he saw Naruto looked up. "If he tried to kill you first, then it was self-defense," Itachi began. "You are allowed to protect yourself, Naruto, even if the person attacking you doesn't have a bloodline. In a fight for your life, fair is whatever lets you win." He saw Naruto muddle over the words in his mind. "I need to go take care of some things. Will you come back here in, say, 3 days? I can bring you some food, maybe some new clothes." Naruto looked down at the tattered remains of his clothes and shrugged. He liked having someone to talk to, even if Itachi did ask some uncomfortable things. It was still better than the silence, and that Itachi had had the chance to capture him and didn't made Naruto's trust in him rise greatly. He nodded to Itachi, and then extended one of his chains to catch a branch in one of the trees surrounding the clearing. Itachi watched Naruto move through the trees using his chains, and remembered Naruto's attempt at the deflection technique. He lives in a 3-dimensional environment. He must be able to calculate those angles because they're the same ones he uses to move through the trees with his chains. Remarkable, Itachi thought as he ran towards the village. He had a whole slew of things to research, and it was already afternoon. If he wanted to have some answers by the time he met with Naruto again, he was going to have to work quickly. Hinata had been waiting outside her mother's room for several hours now, sitting with her uncle as her sister struggled to be born. She had gotten more and more anxious as time went on and her mother remained in labor, and a sense of foreboding had settled over her thoughts as she wrung her hands over and over. Is it supposed to take this long? She finally asked her uncle. She knew it was something her father would have considered inappropriate, not keeping with the traditional Hyuga stoicism, but she was past caring. It's different for each baby, Hisashi said, a reassuring smile on his face. When Neji was born, my wife was in labor for almost 9 hours, while you were only a 4-hour labor. Have faith in your mother, she's stronger than you know. Hinata knew her mother was strong, but they had been outside for so long without even the slightest word. Her mother had gone into the room around noon, and it was well into the darkest part of the night now. Finally her fidgeting seemed to get to Hisashi, who stood up and turned to her. Tell you what, I'll go see if there's been any change and maybe see about you getting a chance to see your mother, okay? Hinata nodded gratefully. Anything to break up the endless waiting. Hisashi opened the door to her mother's room and slipped inside silently. Hinata waited nervously for any word, still worried despite her uncle's assurances. Suddenly, the door to the room burst open and a shape dashed out. Hinata could barely make out the form of her uncle before he accelerated away, and she heard raised voices through the open door, their frantic tones causing Hinata's panic to rise. She was nearly frantic when, not 5 minutes later, Hisashi rushed back into the room with a man in a doctor's white coat. The door slammed shut behind them, and Hinata stared at it in shock. She didn't know how long she'd been staring in a daze for when the door opened, but the sight beyond the doorway shocked her. Her normally reserved father had her uncle in a tight hug, and Hinata could hear his repeated thanks from out in the hallway. Hisashi managed to extract himself from his brother's embrace, and walked over to Hinata. What happened? She asked. Hisashi gave her a tight smile. There were some complications that we almost didn't catch in time, but your mother and sister are fine. Would you like to come see them? Hinata nodded eagerly. She followed her uncle into the room, passing by her father. He looked more exhausted than she'd ever seen him before, his eyes dropping as he swayed on his feet. He smiled slightly at her as she walked past, the first time in nearly 2 years she could remember him doing so. She turned to the bed to look at her new sister, and was struck at how tired her mother looked. She was paler than normal, and her hair hung limply around her head, accentuating the deep bags under her pupil-less eyes. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she had a radiant smile on her face, and she held out a hand to Hinata, who grasped it tightly. In her other arm she held a small sleeping bundle topped by a light smattering of dark hair. This is your sister, Hinata. Hanabi, meet your big sister. Hinata looked at the sleeping bundle in her mother's arms and smiled. Her family had just grown by one, and everything was all right. Hello Hanabi, she whispered to her sleeping sister. Itachi had spent the last 10 hours in the restricted section of the Konoha library, and with each report he read through he felt his anger rise. He'd started out with the records of murders from around 18 months ago, and he'd tracked down the man he thought had tried to kill Naruto relatively quickly. What had surprised him was that the man had been not only an active duty shinobi, but a chunin. Disregarding the fact that the man had attacked a 4-year-old boy, the fact that he'd been killed was a testament to Naruto's will to survive and the lethal power of his chains. Itachi's curiosity had been sparked by the seemingly senseless attack, and he began to comb back through the records to see if he could find any precedent for the man's aggression towards Naruto. When he couldn't find any incident reports, he decided to look in a more oblique fashion. He'd begun to search the hospital records to try and track down any previous attacks on Naruto by the chunin, but the glut of information on Naruto sickened him. If he was reading the dates right, Naruto had been to the hospital no less than 70 times in his first 4 years. His files indicated everything from poisoning to stab wounds, and many of them had apparently happened when Naruto was in his first or second year. That the perpetrators had apparently never been recorded spoke of a vast indifference to Naruto's plight, one Itachi could scarcely comprehend. Why would anyone treat the Yondaime's son like this? More, how could they treat a toddler like this, regardless of whose son he was? Itachi sat in his room that night, working over the information in his mind, and came to one conclusion. Naruto was not safe in Konoha, at least not as he was. His chains were a large advantage, but he was woefully inexperienced in using them against another human being, and would probably be outmaneuvered by the average Chunin. If what Itachi suspected was true, Naruto would be facing a lot more than one Chunin if he returned to Konoha. Itachi looked at the wall his room shared with his brothers, and his resolve hardened. If Naruto wasn't safe in Konoha as he was now, he would have to make him strong enough to survive. Naruto had no one else, and Itachi wasn't sure how high the conspiracy against him went. Some of those injuries would have been enough to have the perpetrator executed, and they would have taken time to inflict. That they'd happened repeatedly without catching any of the perpetrators suggested the cover-up went high, possibly to the top. No, he couldn't trust anyone but himself with this. When Itachi fell asleep that night, he was already calculating how to best improve Naruto's chances of survival and thus preserve the last living link to one of the greatest heroes Konoha had ever known. Naruto's second cubby was remarkably similar to his first, constructed in a high tree from a hollowed-out point that he deepened with his chains. It remained his sanctuary, the one place he felt safe, and was where he kept his greatest treasures. His family was also there, and as such he felt an indefinable pull towards it whenever he felt troubled or insecure. His conversation with Itachi had dredged up memories he'd long buried, and as he sat in the dark he spoke quietly to the carvings he thought of his family, trying to clear his mind from the dark memories. It took him several hours to get it all cleared out, but finally he decided that the talk with Itachi had done more good than bad. Itachi's vindication of his actions went a long way towards his peace of mind, and when he finally dropped off to sleep he had even managed to convince himself that what he'd done had been at least a little bit the other man's fault. He slept free of the nightmares that normally came when his buried trauma surfaced, snug in his tiny sanctuary. Itachi waited in the same clearing he'd met Naruto in 3 days ago, a large backpack in hand. It was almost noon, and he was somewhat worried that Naruto wouldn't show up. The boy had been willing enough to talk to him before, but he was also extremely skittish right now, and it was possible that he would avoid Itachi because of the uncomfortable questions Itachi asked him. It was something Itachi could do nothing about, so he planned for the best and avoided dwelling too much on the alternative. He might have been able to catch Naruto if he could find him, but even an Inuzuka would have trouble tracking someone with Naruto's familiarity with the forest. If he wanted to hide, Itachi would have an extremely tough time tracking him down. It was with a profound sense of relief that Itachi watched Naruto drop from a tree into the clearing, chains retracting behind him. He approached Itachi, but maintained a 2-meter gap between them. Itachi held up the bag in his hand. "I brought you some basics. Clothing, food, nothing fancy." He tossed the bag to Naruto, who caught it with his chains. "Still doesn't trust me enough catch something from me with his hands, or is it simply more convenient to use the chains?" Itachi wondered. He watched Naruto pull out a set of Sasuke's old clothes and look down at his own attire. With a shrug, he pulled off his old top and replaced it with a black t-shirt. His pants followed quickly, replaced with the black shorts. Once Naruto had changed, he looked through the bag's remaining contents and pulled out a kunai, looking at it curiously. He turned to Itachi, looking at him questioningly. "A gift," Itachi said. "I have an offer for you. I'd like to train you." Naruto frowned. Itachi could almost see the thoughts in his head as he looked for the hidden catch in the offer. Paranoia was something that most shinobi were not only familiar with, but considered a good habit. "No catch, Naruto. I want you to be able to defend yourself. If you want to spend your life out here, that is your choice. But I would be doing both Konoha and you a disservice if I allowed those who would do you harm to make the choice for you," Itachi said. He was intensely loyal to the village as a whole, even though he was disgusted with what so many of them had apparently done to Naruto. If he could help the village gain a valuable asset and give Naruto the tools he needed to make some choices about his own life, he felt it was his duty as a loyal Konoha shinobi to try. "You won't make me go back?" Naruto asked after a minute. Itachi could see his indecision, and quickly replied, "No, it is your choice whether or not you want to live in Konoha or stay out here," Itachi said, and then added, "I would never take your freedom from you." He'd had too many of his own choices curtailed to do the same to Naruto unless he absolutely had to. Naruto tilted his head as he heard the last statement. He obviously recognized Itachi's parroting of his own statement from last time, and Itachi hoped it would help his case. Naruto finally nodded. "Will you teach me to do the red eyes?" he asked. Itachi chuckled slightly at that, shaking his head. "The red eyes are the Sharingan, and you have to be born with them. It's like your chains, something only my family can do." Naruto frowned at that, looking at his chains. "Only I can do this?" he said skeptically. Itachi nodded. "Even if I trained for my entire life, I wouldn't be able to make them. They are a part of you, like your arms and legs. Some people are born with blonde hair or black. You were born with the ability to make those chains, just as I was born with the Sharingan." Naruto nodded at that. It made sense, after all. Some people were taller than others or had different colored skin. Why not something like chains? Seeing him nod, Itachi pulled out a set of weights out of his own bag and threw them to Naruto. Naruto looked at them, then back to Itachi. "What do I do with these?" he asked. Itachi looked at him impassively. "You want to protect your freedom?" Naruto nodded. "Then put them on. It will not be easy, but if you let me I can make sure nobody forces you into anything you don't want them to ever again." Naruto stood up a little taller at that. He liked his home in the forest, and he was used to it, but he never wanted to be trapped into something again. He remembered how weak he'd felt when he fought the kidnapper and the terror he'd felt when his chains had first appeared. He reached forward for the weights and missed Itachi's smile. 2 months later, Naruto was never sure if he admired or hated Itachi. He could never pinpoint exactly what made him feel that Itachi took a perverse pleasure in running him into the ground, but he was completely convinced that it was true. Despite that, he also had to admit that he felt better than he ever had in his short life. At first the weights had been torture. They were apparently the lowest in an increasingly heavy series, but to someone Naruto's size they made up a considerable fraction his body weight. It had been a struggle to even move in them at first, compounded by Itachi having him rely solely on his limbs and not his chains. He claimed it was to build up Naruto's physical strength, but Naruto had grown so reliant on his chains for extra mobility that it felt as if someone had told him to run with only one leg. It had slowly gotten better, but every time Naruto seemed to get used to one set of weights Itachi would add more. Sometimes Naruto had nightmares about a room with endlessly larger weights, presided over by Itachi on a throne made of those weights that Naruto had already mastered. In his nightmares he wasn't allowed to leave until he could do 100 push-ups with the entire throne on his back. In between the basic training with weights, Itachi would teach Naruto about the basics of jutsu. At first Naruto had been excited to learn about that, visions of breathing fire or controlling the earth dancing in his head. Itachi had quickly disabused him of that notion, however, saying that until he could learn to draw chakra stably such things were impossible for him. It had taken Naruto nearly a month to get the proper ratio of physical and spiritual energy down, and he'd been excited for all of 30 seconds before Itachi decided to test him. Itachi had immediately pronounced his control as the worst I've ever seen, and sat him down with a leaf in his hands. Itachi had him push chakra from his hand until the leaf was pushed off his hand, and told Naruto that he would move no further in jutsu training until he could keep the leaf afloat above his hand constantly for at least 5 minutes. In the last month the leaves Naruto used had burned, shredded, flown off to embed in trees like tiny razors, and once, inexplicably, actually exploded, but he'd only managed to keep them afloat for 3 minutes. It was slow, frustrating work, but he was making progress. Itachi pushed him harder than he'd ever worked in his entire life, but Naruto couldn't help but admit that he was starting to see why Itachi trained him the way it did. It worked. The one place where Naruto could say he was truly excelling was his kunai and shuriken work. He'd practiced for months on his own before meeting Itachi using purloined equipment, but having someone show him the proper way to throw an equipment in top condition instead of warped or rusting cast-offs made a huge difference. He still couldn't do more than one deflection accurately, but he could at least get in the same general area with a double deflection, something that Itachi always seemed amazed at. His progress at shuriken and kunai offset his grueling work elsewhere, and kept him enthusiastic despite Itachi's refusal to teach him more advanced jutsu until he completed the leaf floating exercise. Today was the second day in a row he'd been training by himself, as Itachi had a mission outside the village. Without Itachi there it seemed wrong to use the training grounds, so Naruto was leaping from tree branch to tree branch with his weights on to practice, stopping every once in a while to grab a leaf and practice his chakra exercises. As he approached the westernmost point of his territory, he stopped. There was a group of 3 people near the clearing where he'd fought the kidnapper, walking slowly with a large picnic basket in hand. Nearly 50 feet up in the large tree he stopped, grabbing hold of a branch and wrapping his chains around him like a cloak, as was his habit when in the trees. He knew most of the ninja who patrolled the areas around his home by sight after all this time, but the group was dressed in kimonos, and seemed out for nothing other than a picnic. Just as he was about to leave, Naruto caught sight of the shortest person in the group and recognized her. It was Hinata. Naruto turned back, his curiosity taking over now. He had seen her several times as he watched over different parts of Konoha over the last 5 months, but it was the first time he'd seen her come outside the walls of her clan compound. He settled down to watch as the group set up for a picnic, and picked up a leaf to practice his exercises. After all, if he didn't get up to 5 minutes, Itachi wouldn't train him in anything cooler. As Hinata walked through the forest with her mother and uncle towards the spot where she'd been rescued from her kidnapper, she wondered again if Naruto was anywhere around here. The last time she'd seen him, he had leapt off into the forest on those strange chains of his, and she couldn't help but wonder if he was all right. When her mother had suggested a walk outside the compound, Hinata, in a rare moment of initiative, had suggested a picnic in the forest. Her mother had initially been wary of going outside the village walls, but her uncle had offered to come along and the area was still well patrolled. She'd seemed surprised when Hinata had suggested the location for the picnic, but chalked it up to an attempt to overcome the bad memories of the place with good experiences. What she didn't know was that Hinata barely associated the area with her kidnapper at all. The compound was where she'd been taken from, but the clearing was where she'd been rescued, where someone had answered her frantic prayers for salvation. She wanted to come back, but only because it was the last place she'd seen Naruto. They set up their picnic in the clearing, and Hinata and her mother talked about inconsequential things while Hanabi gurgled happily from her mother's arms. Hizashi stayed standing initially, but after a few minutes acquiesced to Hinata's mother and sat at the edge of the picnic blanket, nibbling on a sandwich as he kept watch. It was a pleasant excursion, but as time went by, Hinata began to feel a bit ashamed. She'd come out here, chased someone who probably hadn't thought of her at all since that time, besides thinking of how much trouble she'd been to rescue, and now she'd forced her family to come all the way out here for nothing. She tried to hide her thoughts, but her mother seemed to pick up on the little cues she was giving off. "Something wrong, Hinata?" she asked. Hinata blushed, and shook her head. It's nothing, mother," she mumbled. Her mother just smiled gently, and looked at the spot where they'd come upon the Kumo ambassador, pierced by an unknown assailant. "You know, the memories we try most to get away from are often the ones that follow us the most doggedly," she said, looking back to Hinata. "It's only when we turn and force them into the light that we see their true nature, and can put them away for good." Hinata shook her head slightly. She didn't want to put that memory away for good. It was one of the only times she could remember someone besides her mother acting like she mattered, outside of being a clan heir. Someone had risked themselves to save her life, not even knowing who she was. It was a reminder that there was a world of people outside the clan, people who might not see her as hopelessly weak. Her mother caught the blush creeping up her neck, and her thoughts did a quick 180 as she remembered the other part of the story. "Or maybe you're not running away from a memory, but chasing one?" she asked slyly. Hizashi looked at her sideways, an amused smile on his lips. He'd always liked Hitomi, but one of her bad habits was her penchant, an obsession, really, for romantic stories. Apparently even her own daughter wasn't entirely safe from her quirk. Hinata's blush crawled up until her entire face was beet red, and her mother laughed. "Who knows, maybe he's watching over you right now." Hinata ducked her head in embarrassment as Hanabi giggled in response to her mother's laugh. Hitomi finally took pity on her daughter. "You'll see him again if the spirits are kind, dear heart," she said to Hinata. She put a hand under her daughter's chin and pulled her face up until she could look Hinata in the eyes. "After all, I have to thank him for saving one of my 2 precious treasures, don't I?" Hinata nodded shyly. They packed up their meal and filed out of the clearing. As she passed back into the forest, Hinata looked back across the clearing to where she'd last seen Naruto leap away. She would later swear that she saw a pair of blue eyes high up in the trees, watching as they walked away. Itachi walked into the Hokage's office, completed mission scroll in hand. As he handed it to the old man, The Hokage made a motion with his hand and sent the Anbu stationed in the room away. It took only a second for the room to clear, and soon Itachi and the Hokage were the only two left in the room. The Hokage activated the security seals built into the room, and the pressure on Itachi's ears signified the room was sealed to sound. "Your other mission?" the Hokage asked. Itachi nodded. "They've been tentatively suggesting an alliance with several of the clans in Suna, and at least one in Kiri that I could find out about." Itachi pulled another scroll from a hidden pocket in his vest and passed it over. "I wasn't able to find out if they had actually managed to secure an alliance with anyone except for the Kiri clan, but they've made inroads with all of the listed groups." The Hokage sighed, looking every one of his 61 years. "They're really going through with this, aren't they?" The question was rhetorical, and Itachi didn't answer. The Hokage turned to him. "Do you know when they plan to carry out the attack?" Itachi nodded. "It will be sometime in the next 15 months. The equipment that is being stockpiled won't be ready for at least 12 months, so that is the low end of the time scale. I'd planned for 13 months, any more time than that is simply good fortune." Itachi said. The Hokage nodded tiredly. 13 months to avert the largest catastrophe this village has faced since the Kyuubi attack. "Sometimes I hate this job." Itachi could only agree silently. The Hokage was a thankless position, requiring enormous amounts of effort and sacrifice only to see everything you built come constantly under attack, sometimes even from the very people you built it for. The sacrifices demanded by the position were enormous, and Itachi respected the man in front of him immensely for taking up the hat not only once but twice. The Hokage looked up at him. "You may go. Keep me informed." Itachi inclined his head in a shallow bow and exited the office. As he headed back to the Uchiha district, he pondered the problem in front of him. He had 13 months to change the course of his entire clan, or betray the village he loved in order to follow his family in treason. Sometimes he envied Naruto and his simple life in the forest. Freedom, thought Itachi, is not always about doing what you want when you want. Sometimes it's about choosing the set of shackles you can live with wearing later. Sometimes it's just the ability to live with what you've been forced to do. His sleep that night was restless, and he could almost feel the time limit hanging over his head. 13 months to make a decision. But how could he make a decision when both options led to an option he wasn't sure he could live with? For Itachi, the last few months had been both some of the best times of his life and the worst. He still hadn't been able to figure out an acceptable answer to his biggest problem, deciding between his clan and his loyalty to Konoha, but in training Naruto he'd found a simple purpose. It was something he could devote himself wholly to, something that required no subterfuge or agonizingly sleepless nights, for which Itachi was constantly grateful. Even more, Naruto was genuinely fun for Itachi to teach. Unlike his brother, who seemed to focus on being a carbon copy of Itachi in the hopes of beating him at his own game, Naruto was constantly surprising the stoic Uchiha. He still smiled fondly every time he thought of some of Naruto's more outlandish attempts as the ninja arts, such as his copy of Itachi's own crow clone technique. Itachi had been working with Naruto for just over 3 months, and they had finally gotten around to working on the basic 3 jutsus. Naruto had shown some aptitude for the substitution technique and the transformation technique, but his clone was, well, abysmal. Itachi had noticed early on that Naruto's chakra reserves were far larger than was normal for someone his age, and while Naruto's control had improved drastically under his tutelage, the basic clone used so little chakra that it was like trying to get a tiny drop of water from a raging fire hose. Itachi had broached the subject of using a different clone technique, one that Naruto would have less trouble with because of its higher chakra cost, and Naruto had taken to it immediately. However, when Naruto had asked Itachi about his crow clone, Itachi had explained that only a holder of the crow summoning contract could perform the technique. Naruto's response the next day had left him temporarily speechless. They had been working on clone techniques again, and Naruto had picked up the shadow clone with a speed that surprised Itachi, even after his previous quick process. He seemed to instinctively understand the jutsu, and his large chakra reserves made it an effective combat modifier for the small boy. Itachi had broken out in a cold sweat as he thought about facing a dozen Narutos, all wielding those transparent chains, but was broken from his reverie by a familiar sight as he saw Naruto break apart in a flock of crows. Itachi instinctively activated his Sharingan, assuming it was an illusion, but Naruto was nowhere to be seen. Itachi immediately made a quick series of hand signs and slammed his palm onto the ground, summoning a large crow with a scroll attached to its feet. He grabbed the scroll and opened it, but was greeted only by his own name on the summoning contract. He stared dumbly at the signature, mind feverishly spinning in circles as he tried to figure out how Naruto had managed to summon crows without a contract, when Naruto walked out from behind a tree with a large smile on his face. At Itachi's gobsmacked expression, Naruto had laughed and proceeded to summon a shadow clone. The clone made the hand sign for a basic transformation, and Itachi stared at the clone as it pulled apart in a flock of crows. Now that he was paying attention, he noticed the crows disperse into smoke as soon as they spread out, their distance from one another causing too much strain on the transformation for the clone to survive, but it was an effective bluff nonetheless. It was rare for anyone to use any sort of substitution with a clone, so anyone seeing the ruse would assume Naruto had managed to disappear in the same way Itachi himself had. Such out-of-the-box thinking was, as Itachi had learned, simply the way Naruto's mind worked. He had been on his own for so long that he'd never built up the same assumptions and preconceptions that most of Konoha's shinobi had, either from the academy or their family training, so he simply didn't know when something couldn't be done. Itachi himself had adapted some of Naruto's more practical ideas, like using clones as substitution targets or substituting with stationary objects as a sort of bastardized shunshin, and he had garnered interest amongst several of his Anbu colleagues with his unorthodox methods. Even his best friend Shisui had been shocked at the idea of using a substitution for movement instead of just dodging, and was working on a way to incorporate it into his shunshin heavy fighting style. Naruto had opened up to him much more over the last few months, and Itachi learned that, behind that suspicious exterior, something of the original 4-year-old that had gone into the woods had survived to influence his personality. As time went on, he exhibited more exuberant behavior when happy, and was almost frighteningly single-minded when he had a goal in front of him, to the point that Itachi had had more than one talk with him about the importance of resting in order to keep himself healthy. He would, if given the chance, train himself into the ground with a determination that would have made Might Guy proud. The one area that Itachi had been more or less unable to help Naruto with was his chains. He could see with his Sharingan that they were incredibly dense chakra constructs, wrapped in a chakra shell that caused them to emit almost no waste energy, but that was the most he'd figure out so far. They remained difficult to perceive with the Sharingan due to this lack of chakra emission, but more disturbingly their independent movement and lack of physical tells meant that he couldn't predict their movements. The more time he spent with Naruto, the more convinced he became that those chains would be an incredibly effective tool in the future. Unfortunately, Itachi's had slipped up in a conversation about Naruto's bloodline and mentioned that he'd a woman with the same ability, someone Naruto had correctly deduced was his mother. He'd begged Itachi for any information about his parents, something so out of character for the normally closed-off boy that he'd felt a pit open up in his stomach. He could almost see an overlay of his brother in Naruto, and the thought of such desperation over something so intrinsic as simply knowing basic things about your family. Itachi had told Naruto what little he knew of his parents, not that it was much considering his age when they died. To Naruto, however, it was like water in the desert, and he'd soaked up every word with rapt attention. If anything, Naruto's dedication to his training had redoubled at hearing that both his parents were shinobi of Konoha. It was as if training in the ninja arts was a tangible connection to his parents in his mind, and his progress had likewise increased. Now, almost 6 months into his training with Naruto, Itachi had decided that Naruto had enough basic skills that he could train without hurting himself too badly, and began to teach him one of the most important lessons for any ninja. When to use those skills, and why. Naruto, Itachi began, looking at the boy where he was seated in front of him. When you think of a shinobi, what comes to mind? Do you see a hero, like your father? A silent killer, like the man who drove you into the woods? He stared at Naruto expectantly. This was important, and he needed to be sure that he imprinted the responsibility that came with the skills that he was training Naruto in. He had decided to give Naruto the means to make his own choices, but he had seen more than one shinobi turn in on themselves when they came across this question without help. Too many people couldn't separate the person from the job. Naruto looked down for a moment, deep in thought. Itachi waited patiently for his answer, and Naruto had sensed that this was something his teacher felt was very important, so he tried not to answer flippantly. Finally he looked at Itachi. "I think of someone with freedom," he said. Itachi blinked, confused. "Someone with freedom? In what way?" he asked. Naruto took a deep breath. "A shinobi has power, but that isn't who they are. A shinobi is someone that can protect or destroy." Naruto's expression was an open book to Itachi, and he could almost see the specters of the Yondaime and the faceless man who'd tried to kill him over Naruto's shoulders. Naruto shook himself slightly, and continued. "That power, it means you can choose your path. I mean, my parents died protecting the village when the Kyuubi attacked. They left me alone, and I'll never know what they were like, who they were as people. But they saved everyone. So I guess they used their freedom to choose to protect the people of the village, even if it meant leaving me alone. I might not like it, but it was their choice, because that's what freedom is. The ability to do what you think is right, even if it means the people closest to you suffer for it. Because sometimes there are more important things." Itachi sat shocked. Naruto was only 6.5, but this sounded like something he'd mulled over for a long time. Itachi looked at Naruto, worried about lingering resentment from what he'd heard, but could only see acceptance on Naruto's face. He's been thinking about this for a long time. It must have been something that he had to come with terms with when he learned about his parents, that they died in the Kyuubi attack. And it's become the core of how he looks at them. They had a choice, and he accepts that. He trains as hard as he does so that he can understand their choice, and maybe one day see if he could have found a better path. Itachi mused, and then looked Naruto in the eye. "You're right, that's as good an explanation as any. A shinobi has to choose their path, choose whether to protect themselves or others. Sometimes that choice isn't easy, but the ones that truly matter are never the easiest choices. If you find the thing you want to protect amongst all others, then you've found your true path. Never forget that, and no matter which path you choose, you'll be able to stand proud as a shinobi." Naruto nodded thoughtfully. Itachi sat alone on top of the Hokage monument that night, looking over the village. He saw the light coming from hundreds of windows, the lives he was sworn to protect sitting comfortably under his aegis. That's what freedom is. The ability to do what you think is right, even if it means the people closest to you suffer for it. Itachi closed his eyes as he remembered Naruto's words. Is it really that simple? He wondered. Once again, Naruto had pulled everything out of the normal patterns Itachi lived in, and now he couldn't help but look at his options differently. On the one hand, if he sided with the village, then his clan would be destroyed, their name tarnished. The thought was almost physically painful for Itachi. But if he sided with his clan, he would be betraying every oath he'd ever sworn, and at best would plunge the village into a bloody civil war. His options were both terrible, but he could see only one that would allow him to hold his head high in the village, only one that would allow him to keep on the path he'd followed for so long. He pulled himself to his feet, and ran quickly across the rooftops toward the Hokage's tower, where he could still see a light burning in the candle. It was late, but the Hokage's work was never done, and they had a coup to prevent. Naruto sat on a branch high above the walls of Konoha and looked at the village that had caused him so much pain. His talk with Itachi 3 weeks ago had given him many sleepless nights, and he'd driven himself to exhaustion training to try and quiet his mind. If you find the thing you want to protect amongst all others, then you've found your true path. Never forget that, and no matter which path you choose, you'll be able to stand proud. Naruto had gone over the words 1,000 times, and still had no answer. What did he want to protect? He wasn't sure he wanted to protect the village that had hated him, chased him into the woods. But that same village had produced Hinata and Itachi, so they couldn't all be bad, right? He knew that at the very least he wanted to be able to protect those two, and to live up to the sacrifice his parents had made. After all, they had sacrificed themselves to protect the people here, so he should at least try and give them another chance. These thoughts had flown around his head night after night, and he'd taken to watching different parts of the village to pass the sleepless hours. His favorites were the Uchiha and Hyuga clan compounds. They were on opposite sides of the range of forest he lived in, but when he watched them he sometimes got glimpses of his important people, and that made the trek worth it. What confused him was the difference in how people treated the two of them. From what Itachi had said, Hinata was supposed to be the next head of the Hyuga clan. But the people in the compound, in particular one older man, seemed to treat her badly much of the time. Naruto would almost have said the man hated her, but sometimes he would see the same man escorting her around, like the time they'd had a picnic in the forest. It was almost like they were two separate people. By contrast, every time he spotted Itachi in the compound, people treated him like royalty, always bowing or acting respectfully around him. It was a mystery, but he didn't want to admit to Itachi that he spied on them, nor that he was having trouble sleeping, so he couldn't figure it out for now. The thing you want to protect, he thought to himself, then shrugged. He'd figure it out eventually. Hiruzen Sarutobi stood in the bowels of one of the subterranean Anbu bases hidden around Konoha with two of his most trusted ninja, and put the finishing touches on the most abhorrent act he'd ever considered. "You're sure you can do this by yourselves?" he said to the two Uchiha in front of him. Itachi had been in on the plan since its conception nearly 2 years ago, but Shisui had only been apart for the last 6 months. If it hadn't been for Itachi vouching for him, and the truth seal he'd submitted to questioning under, Hiruzen would never have risked bringing in the boy. "We can do it. With Shisui's Mangekyo and my own skills, we'll be able to catch them by surprise. By the time they know something is wrong, the most dangerous elements will already be neutralized." Itachi nodded at Danzo, who nodded sharply and stepped forward. "We'll have loyal Anbu agents ready in the surrounding area, in case any of them try to escape." Hiruzen had never liked Danzo's willingness to engage in questionable means to accomplish a goal, but he would never deny the man was thorough. Then all that's left is to wait. 1 month from now, the Uchiha clan will only have 2 members left. Hiruzen said, a bitter taste in his mouth. Surely this wasn't what his senseis had in mind when they brought the Uchiha and Senju together to live in one village. The other 3 nodded, and began to disperse. Hiruzen barely noticed Itachi following until a hand touched his shoulder. "Itachi, what can I do for you?" he asked, trying to shake himself from the dark thoughts. "I have a favor, Hokage-sama," he said, his tone respectful. He looked apprehensive, a break from his normal passive stoicism. "I know what we're doing is necessary." Again Hiruzen felt bile in the back of his throat. "But my brother knows nothing of the plans for a coup. He is innocent. I ask nothing for myself, just that my brother be allowed to live." Itachi stared at Hiruzen, his black eyes pleading. Hiruzen thought for a second, but it was a foregone conclusion. He could condone the death of an entire clan for the good of the village, but part of that was the abstract concept involved with the Uchiha name being eradicated. To outright refuse to allow an innocent child to survive if it was in his power, now that he'd been made aware of Sasuke's ignorance. "You're sure he knows nothing of the coup?" Hiruzen asked, and Itachi nodded. "Then I'll allow it. Let me tell Danzo tomorrow, but you may spare him." Itachi had a visible look of relief on his face. The thought of killing his family was agonizing, that much was plain to see, but Hiruzen could only be glad he could spare this honorable young ninja the pain of killing his only sibling. As Itachi walked away from him, Hiruzen took a long drag on his pipe. "The things we do for the village. I just hope I can sleep again after this. I have too many nightmares as it is." Naruto stood in the clearing he used to train with Itachi, pacing nervously. Itachi was late, something that had never happened in all the time Naruto had known him. He was considering running over to the trees overlooking the Uchiha compound and trying to spot him from there when he spotted Itachi coming in from the other side of the clearing. He opened his mouth to call out a greeting, but closed it when he saw the look on Itachi's face. "What's wrong?" he asked as Itachi stopped in front of him. He was dressed in full Anbu gear, mask hanging off the side of his head. Itachi blinked, seeming to collect himself, and then his normal expressionless mask slipped back in place. "I'm going on a mission, Naruto." "A long one," Naruto frowned. Itachi had gone on long missions before, once for over 3 weeks, but something in his expression or tone told Naruto this was different. "For how long? When are you coming back?" Naruto asked, a hint of panic in his voice. Itachi was the one of the very few constant things in his life. He was the person who'd given Naruto a small window into his parents, and was Naruto's gateway to the rest of the world. If he disappeared, I don't know. A long time, maybe years. Naruto felt numb at the words. He looked at Itachi, trying furiously to keep tears from forming in his eyes. Itachi took a scroll from behind his back. "These are some chakra exercises to help you with your control, and a jutsu of my own creation. It will be useful for you, especially with your shadow clone mastery." Naruto nodded, taking the scroll. "You're leaving right now?" Itachi shook his head. "Tonight, but there is another task I have to do in the village. I won't be able to see you again before I go." Naruto nodded, and then turned back to Itachi. "Stay here," he said. Itachi tilted his head slightly, looking at Naruto curiously as he ran back into the forest. It was nearly 20 minutes before Naruto came back, holding something in his hands. He came to a stop in front of Itachi, who studiously ignored the tears at the corners of his eyes. "Here," he said, extending his hand. Itachi took the object he was presented, and looked down at it. It was a smooth piece of wood, carved by something sharp. He recognized Naruto's handiwork in the crude drawing, only a little better now than when he'd first met the boy. It was a carving of Naruto, his two iconic chains over his shoulders, standing next to a carving of a boy with short hair holding a kunai in each hand, ready to throw. They were labeled with Naruto's and Itachi's names. "So you don't have to be alone on your mission. If my family can keep me company, then I can keep you company." Naruto smiled at him. Itachi looked at the carving, then silently and carefully put it away in one of the inside pouches of his Anbu vest. "Thank you, Naruto," he said, his voice low. He put his hand on Naruto's shoulder, squeezing lightly, and then turned. He pulled his animal mask over his face, the cat-like features covering his features. Naruto watched him walk to the edge of the clearing, then dissolve into a flock of crows. Naruto pulled out the scroll, a smile on his face, and began to train. After all, just because Itachi was gone didn't mean he couldn't better himself. When Itachi returned to the village, Naruto would show him just how strong he'd become. Itachi couldn't pinpoint one exact reason why the knight had gone to hell, not because the decline was subtle, but because there was too many. First he'd found Shisui with only one eye, just in time for his best friend to rip out his other eye and entrust the valuable Mangekyo to Itachi for safekeeping. While Itachi had stood, shocked at his friend's actions, Shisui had thrown himself into the river, and Itachi had been unable to find him. He'd tried to complete the eradication of the Uchiha by himself, growing sickened at each murder, only to come upon his parents seated calmly in their room. Far from vilifying him for his action, his father had told him how much he respected Itachi for following his convictions to the end. Worse, his mother had simply told him how proud she was of the man he'd become, and how much she loved him. All she'd asked was that he look after Sasuke. It had torn Itachi's heart from his chest to kill his parents after hearing that, but they had made their choice just as he had. The last nail in the coffin had been coming across his brother, drenched in his parents' blood. The look of confusion on Sasuke's face, the terrified screams as he'd used Tsukiyomi to direct all of Sasuke's hatred on him. It was all spinning in Itachi's head as he carried out his mission. As he'd headed to the rendezvous point to report in, he'd had to stop next to a stream to empty his stomach, unable to handle the nausea caused by his actions. His new Mangekyo saw too much, and he couldn't forget any of it, not one little detail. It had taken him almost 10 minutes to pull himself together enough to fake his normal facade enough to report in. "It's done?" Danzo asked from the shadows. Itachi nodded, his mask hiding the pallor of his face. "Then you know the next part of your mission," Danzo said. "You'll take care of Sasuke?" Itachi asked. It was the only thing keeping him going at this point. "Your brother will be treated as royalty, the last of the respected Uchiha clan. He will never know of your clan's betrayal." Danzo hesitated. "You're sure you don't want to remain in Konoha? Anbu are faceless after all. A simple change of mask and we could give you a new identity." Danzo was not overly emotional, but the loss of such an asset as Itachi was unfortunate, and he would avoid it if possible. Regardless, Itachi shook his head. "I can do more on the other mission. I am uniquely suited for that assignment." Danzo nodded slightly. "Then I wish you good luck. Your first check-in is in 1 month, in the capital of Rice Country." Itachi nodded, and Danzo slipped back into the shadows. Itachi ran up the wall next to him, and leapt off into the forest. He had only gone about 3/4 of a mile when he sensed a familiar presence shadowing him. He pulling into a clearing and stopped. "You can come out, Naruto. I know you're there," he called out quietly. He knew how acute Naruto's hearing was, there was no reason to shout. He watched the boy step out of the trees, his now light red hair the only thing differentiating him from the shadows around him. In a detached part of his mind, Itachi was proud to see how well Naruto was applying his stealth training. Naruto stared at Itachi silently for several minutes, his eyes boring into the holes in Itachi's Anbu mask. Finally he spoke one word. "Why?" he asked. Surprisingly, there was no condemnation in his tone. Itachi knew that Naruto had somehow discovered his actions that night, but how could he not hate Itachi after what he'd done? After all, even Itachi hated himself over his mission tonight. I had to prove myself, Itachi said, falling back on the same story he'd told Sasuke. I had to know the limits of my power, so I used them to test myself. They were nothing more than the meter I used to measure my growth. Naruto's expression didn't change at all as Itachi spoke. Itachi waited for him to say something, to yell at him for betraying the very principles he's instilled in Naruto over the last year. His answer shocked Itachi and sent him scrambling. Then why were you sick after doing it? One simple sentence, and Itachi's narrative was destroyed. He cursed Naruto's penchant for sneaking and his night vision. How could I not have noticed him watching me? He wondered and then answered his own question. He was so messed up from killing his family that even a civilian could probably have snuck up on him. For someone like Naruto who'd spent years avoiding forest patrols, it had been child's play. His mind was racing to come up with another reason, one that would keep Naruto off the truth and be believable. Naruto continued to stare at him, and then repeated his words from the long-ago conversation in the training grounds. Sometimes we have to do what's right, even if it hurts the ones closest to us. Itachi looked at him in surprise. Naruto just shrugged. I don't know why you did what you did, but I have faith in you, Itachi-sensei. He spoke. Itachi rocked back on his heels. The simple words had a profound effect. He'd worried about what Naruto would think of him after today, and to find out he didn't vilify him was cleansing. Itachi was struck by the sudden urge to explain himself, to have anyone know the truth outside of the Hokage and Danzo. He couldn't bring himself to tell Naruto the whole truth, but he could at least let him know that he hadn't betrayed Naruto, that the things he'd taught him were still worthwhile. Sometimes we have to follow orders that we hate, in order to protect what we love. Itachi spoke quietly, and saw Naruto nod, though his eyes narrowed. Itachi watched as he looked back at the village, remembering the times Itachi had told him about his reasons for serving the village, about his philosophy about the duty of a shinobi. Itachi saw the connections forming, and a look of resolution came over his face. "You're not coming back, are you?" he asked. Itachi shook his head. "No, I'll be branded a missing ninja after this." Naruto frowned. "That's not right." Itachi cut him off. "It's what I chose. My sacrifice is a small one, in the grand scheme of things. If this keeps the village safe, then I'll gladly pay it." Naruto looked at him. "Then I'll protect it for you," he said stubbornly. Itachi's eyes widened. If Naruto really meant that, the possibilities began to run through his head. He didn't want to force Naruto into something out of a misplaced sense of obligation to Itachi, but Naruto was strong now, strong enough to protect himself from any civilians and most of the lower-ranked ninja at least. He would be safer in Konoha, especially with the hunter nin that would be combing the country for him. Another thought struck him, and he smiled inwardly. If he was going to send his surrogate little brother into the lion's den, so to speak, there was one more set of claws he could give him. "If you truly mean that, then you'll need to see the Hokage after you wake up," he said. "Tell him nothing of speaking to me though, Naruto. This is a secret you cannot speak to anyone of, under pain of death. My sacrifice would be in vain otherwise." Naruto nodded slowly, not truly understanding but trusting that Itachi knew what he was talking about, then stopped. "Wait, what do you mean wake up?" Naruto said, confused. Itachi simply looked at him, the 3 kamas of his activated Sharingan spinning. As Naruto fell to the ground unconscious, he reached into the vest of his Anbu vest and pulled out an object. "The last gift I can give you, Naruto, use it wisely." Deep inside Naruto's subconscious, trapped behind great iron bars and a seal insignia, the Kyuubi growled as his container was put under a genjutsu by the Sharingan. "Those eyes are an abomination," he grumbled quietly to himself. He couldn't help but feel a bit of camaraderie with his host over the situation, however. He'd been under the Sharingan's influence, and knew exactly how powerful it could be. That didn't mean he wouldn't make fun of his container for falling to that trick again the next time they met, however. He couldn't see anything through the seal, but he could sense the chakras around him, and noticed the Itachis coming closer. There was a familiar sense as he activated a jutsu, and the Kyuubi looked up at the top of his cage as if he could see through it. "Oh, what's this?" he said softly, curiosity and surprise present in his voice. A second later he felt a second chakra signature, too small to be another person, interact with the jutsu Itachi was using. You sneaky son of a. Now things are getting interesting. He chuckled at that. I can't wait to see how this plays out. I haven't been part of anything that interesting since, well, since the last time I fought Hashirama. The Kyuubi mused to himself. It was rather boring, being trapped inside the stomach of a 7-year-old, but now he had something to look forward to. Don't die too soon, Kit, he mumbled to himself. This is just getting fun. He laughed long and hard at that, as Naruto slumbered, unaware of his tenant's amusement. When Naruto woke, he had a pounding headache and a curse on his lips for red-eyed idiots and genjutsus in general. He pulled his aching body slowly to his feet, and stumbled over to a nearby stream. A long drink and several splashes of cold water later, he felt more awake. Judging by the position of the sun, it was still early morning, no more than 2 or 3 hours since sunrise. He thought back to his meeting with Itachi, and the cryptic remarks he'd made. He said he was following orders. Naruto thought, and if he can't tell me about it, then maybe whoever ordered it can, but I can't ask if what Itachi-sensei said was right. He concluded with a nod. If he was ever going to find out what had happened to cause Itachi to massacre his family like that, he was going to have to find a way to get into the Hokage's records, or someone else suitably highly placed. Naruto's head throbbed at the thought of how long a plan like that would take. Might as well just become the Hokage at that point. He grumbled to himself. Either way, he had his directions from Itachi, and they seemed like a good idea anyways. He was a little wary of going back to the village, but no longer feared the civilians. After all, if what Itachi had said was true, he was stronger than most of the genin in the village, so a civilian shouldn't be any danger. It took him nearly an hour to reach his destination, and he was relieved to see his targets out in the open. It would be much more difficult to get close to them if they were inside or under guard, and he didn't really trust anyone else to help him. He climbed the wall around the compound with ease, his chains acting as anchors while his feet gripped the slippery wall with a thin coating of chakra. At the top, he anchored one chain into the wall, and wrapped the other around him like a cloak. Itachi had told him that the chain confused his Sharingan, and would probably be difficult to detect for anyone who relied on chakra to see. He'd also given Naruto a crash course on the other bloodline users in Konoha, so Naruto knew he'd need every advantage he could get to remain unseen. Thankfully, either due to his own efforts or the commotion around the massacre at the Uchiha estate, he managed to make it into the gardens he'd been aiming for without anyone raising the alarm. He allowed his anchor line to dissipate at the top, retracting the rest inside himself, and took a deep breath to gather his courage. This would be the first time in more than 3 years that he'd had any real contact with someone other than Itachi. Before his courage could flag, he stepped resolutely out of the bushes in front of his targets. They both looked at him in surprise, the older woman falling back into a defensive stance. Hi, Naruto said awkwardly, not sure what to do about the woman apparently ready to beat him senseless. Could you take me to the Hokage by any chance? Hiruzen looked at the report on his desk with a scowl on his face. 134 people dead because Fugaku couldn't be content with what he had, he thought. Rarely had Hiruzen seen so much waste for so little reason. This whole operation had left a bad taste in his mouth, even before Shisui had disappeared. Now, instead of there being 3 loyal Uchiha left, there was only one 7-year-old boy. He sighed. What a mess. He looked up at a knock on his door, and his secretary poked her head in. His 2 Anbu guards, Inu and Kat, had been pulled off the search for Naruto to help with manpower as they cleaned up the massacre, and they tensed minutely as the door opened before relaxing as they recognized the woman. Hokage-sama? Hiruzen motioned for her to continue. I have the Hyuga matriarch here to see you. She says it's important. Hiruzen told her to let them in, frowning. The Lady Hyuga had called on him before, and he was curious about what could be so important on today of all days. The door opened again, and 3 people filed into the room. The first 2 Hiruzen recognized as Hitomi Hyuga and her daughter Hinata, who was hiding slightly behind her mother. As he saw the third figure, however, his face went slack. As his pipe hit the desk, Inu did a double take. You, he shouted, making the Hyuga girl flinch. A small smile pulled the boy's mouth upwards, and Hiruzen had the distinct impression he enjoyed Inu's reaction before turning back to Hiruzen. Hello Hokage-sama, he said. Hiruzen simply stared for a moment, his headache increasing as he thought of the oncoming paperwork. He smiled wryly. Hello Naruto. Hiruzen stared at the boy in front of him, his mind still caught in a daze. It seemed the day did, in fact, have one more sucker punch to throw at him. The fallout from Itachi's massacre would bury him in paperwork and meetings for a month, but the recovery of the Kyuubi Jinchuriki would send the balance of power in the council, already precarious with the loss of the Uchiha clan, into complete disarray as they fought over who would be put in charge of Naruto's training, not to mention preventing him from fleeing again. He could already hear the screeching of the civilian council in his head, and he could swear the headache already pressing on his temples was a conditioned response by now. You know, of all the ways I could have imagined us meeting again, Naruto, this has to be the least likely of them all. He said, a wry smile tugging the corners of his mouth up. Nearly 3 years those two have been looking for you. He motioned with his hand to Inu and Neiko, the former of which looked as if he wanted to grab Naruto and shake him until he understood just how frustrating the last 2 years had been, and you just walk into my office the day after one of the worst incidents in our village's history. Forgive an old man his curiosity, but why now? Hiruzen had always been a good judge of people. Decades of holding the highest office in the village and dealing with the political machinations of the council had left him able to decipher most people's general motivations at a glance. He'd known Naruto for most of his life before his disappearance, and before today would have bet most people nearly anything that he could tell Naruto's state of mind at a glance. After all, he'd never been the most subtle of children. Now, however, all Hiruzen could tell of Naruto's state of mind was that he was guarded, and his body language was subtly telling him that Naruto considered everyone in the room except for possible Hitomi and Hinata as threats. More than surprise, Hiruzen felt a wave of sadness pass over him. What happened to him over the last 3 years, Naruto? Where did the happy child go? Hiruzen wondered to himself. He knew Naruto had participated in at least 2 fairly horrendous situations, at least one of which he felt somewhat responsible for, but he had hoped that something of Naruto's happy-go-lucky against-all-comers attitude had survived. Naruto looked at him, his gaze unwavering, and Hiruzen saw something there. Purpose maybe, or resolve. Whatever had driven Naruto from hiding, it was important to him. I made a promise to someone to help protect the village, Hokage-sama. The Uchiha are gone, and that means that the village will need help, and I want to do what I can. The forest is my home, will always be my home. But if I stay out there I would be going back on my word, and betraying the only person who has ever shown complete faith in me. I can't do that. For a second, Hiruzen saw the same 4-year-old he'd known before, the one who would do anything in his limited power to keep a promise, even at such a young age. His relief at seeing something, anything, of the old Naruto rushed through him, almost negating the pain he felt at the knowledge that Naruto felt he'd lost faith in him at some point. Hiruzen looked at the 2 people that had accompanied Naruto, acknowledging their presence for the first time. And what of you and your daughter, Lady Hyuga? How is it that you came to be escorting young Naruto today? He almost winced as he saw Hinata curl further behind her mother. Hiyashi really needs to tone it down. At this rate she'll have a nervous breakdown before she's 15. A fake clan heir going off the reservation is bad enough, we don't need a real one. He thought critically, but he knew he had little say in clan matters. Hiyashi's pride was pushing him down this path, and much as Hiruzen wished he could do something to change it, the law was firmly on the Hyuga clan head's side. Glancing down at her daughter briefly, Hitomi squeezed Hinata's hand reassuringly once, then turned back to the Hokage. Naruto approached my daughter and I this morning in our garden and requested an escort to see you, Hokage-sama. Hitomi said easily. Her smile said there was something more to the story, and Hiruzen quickly caught the disparate element. An unknown child dressed in worn clothing was allowed into the inner gardens of the Hyuga compound at— He glanced at the clock on his wall and did some quick math. 8:15 in the morning, roughly? He asked skeptically. Hitomi's smile just widened a fraction of an inch, and Hiruzen noticed a small amount of red in Naruto's cheeks. Naruto correctly assumed that, in light of the debt the Hyuga clan owes him, he would be permitted in the clan estates. That he chose to forego all of the normal pleasantries normally associated with entry into the inner gardens was simply a reflection of how important he felt meeting with you in a timely manner was. Hiruzen felt his eyes widen as he worked out the implications of her response. Obviously Naruto had not been approved to enter the inner gardens, which meant he'd snuck in. And if he'd managed to avoid the guards of a clan with a dojutsu that allowed them to see 360 degrees. That much stealth potential at such a young age was rare enough to merit interest all on its own. How? He asked her. Before she could answer, two transparent chains burst from Naruto, wrapping around his body until only the pointed tips were free, poised over his shoulders. Their manifestation had been so fast that Hiruzen had barely registered their presence before the boy was covered from thigh to neck in solidified chakra. He noticed that the two Anbu had moved to defensive positions, but subtly motioned for them to stand down when he saw that Naruto was making no moves beyond the initial manifestation. Amazing, Hiruzen murmured. He stepped toward Naruto to get a closer look at the chains, and noticed the tips following him as he did so. I haven't seen anything like this since. His voice trailed off, but he never expected what he heard next. Since my mother, I assume. Naruto's voice was even, but Hiruzen caught the undertone of anger as he spoke. Naruto's eyes caught his own and held them. The betrayal burning in them left no doubt that he had discovered Hiruzen's deception regarding his parents. Hiruzen's hand came down almost reflexively, activating the security and privacy seals built into the walls of the office before anyone could say anything. How long? Hiruzen asked, ignoring the confused looks on the faces of the two Hyuga. The night I killed Akihiro. Naruto's voice didn't change at all when he answered, but Hiruzen winced inwardly as he remembered the night. More, he saw Hitomi's face whip toward Naruto, and he could read her expression well enough to know she was putting the pieces about the Chunin's death together. Hiruzen sighed again. This day just kept getting worse and worse. He took a deep breath and turned to Naruto. What would you have me do? He asked warily. Naruto only took a breath, seeming to steady himself before he spoke. Nothing, Hokage-sama. I'm not back because of my parents. Harping on their memory at this point would be dishonorable, and they've suffered enough betrayals. Hiruzen was unable to keep himself from flinching as he heard the blunt statement, but couldn't find it in himself to argue. I'm here to fulfill a promise to protect the village to the best of my abilities. All I ask is that you help me do that. Naruto finished. Hiruzen sat for a minute, pulling on his pipe as he thought. Reintroducing Naruto to the village would be difficult, to say the least. Even if he disregarded the standard power plays that had always surrounded him, deflecting the accusations of the council over Akihiro's death or the attack on the Kumo ambassador would be problematic. Technically the Hokage was the supreme authority in Konoha, but the council could make his life extremely difficult if they chose. When he finally turned to Naruto, he knew that his answer would not make the boy happy. As much as I would love to help you, Naruto, you have to realize there are certain issues that some on the council would have with you rejoining the village. It's highly likely they would try to prevent you from becoming a normal shinobi. Naruto nodded as he heard that, only the slight tightening at the corners of his eyes giving away his irritation. Because of this, right? Naruto said, placing his hand over his stomach. Hiruzen gasped in shock as he heard Naruto casually refer to the Kyuubi sealed inside him, and as a consequence pulled in a lungful of smoke. Coughing heavily to try and expel some of the smoke from his lungs, he looked at Naruto in shock. How? Cough. How did you? His question tapered off as Naruto shook his head, his face harder than any child's had a right to be. Hiruzen nodded slightly, willing to wait for an explanation at a later time. Finally expelling the last of the smoke, he looked at Naruto's stomach briefly before returning to his face. Yes, that is the main reason. They will try to hold you in reserve as a last resort or deterrent, and frankly you're too well known around the village. If we tried to pass you off as someone else they would find out right away. Hiruzen said, his face drawn. He hated the thought of condemning the boy to a life like that, hated for his burden but unable to escape it because of the potential power. He was about to suggest that Naruto possibly try for another path, maybe T&I, when Inu cut in. I'm sorry Hokage-sama, but that might not strictly be true. He said slowly. Hiruzen looked at him sharply, along with every other person in the room, then motioned for him to continue. You're looking at this from the perspective of someone who has known Naruto for most of his life, spent a large amount of time checking up on a covert search for him. For someone who wasn't familiar with him, the boy looks nothing like he did before. Hiruzen frowned, and looked at Naruto critically before shaking his head. His hair may be different, and his face thinner, but there's no way anyone will mistake the marks on his face or his eyes. He'd never make it past the first class at the academy before someone outed him. To his surprise, Inu chuckled and shook his head. With all due respect, Hokage-sama, those are small problems. The marks on his face can be covered up with cosmetics or a mask. He pulled up his dog mask slightly to show the mask covering the lower part of his face. And as for his eyes, a pair of sunglasses will hide those well enough. The Hokage snorted. And what, wear the glasses 24/7? That would draw too much attention, it'd be obvious he's trying to hide. He said sarcastically. Inu only shrugged. Have you even seen an Aburame without their glasses? I've been guarding you at council meetings for years, and I still don't know Shibi Aburame's eye color. Make his true identity an S-class secret and lock it in the Hokage vaults, and unless he tells someone they'll never connect him with a runaway. In 2 or 3 years he'll have grown up enough that even without a disguise he'll be unrecognizable from his 4-year-old self, and it won't matter by then. Hiruzen frowned as Inu finished, then slowly nodded. He'd become so accustomed to the backstabbing politics of the council over the years that he sometimes forgot what tools he had at his disposal as Hokage. Yes, that might just work. He looked sharply at Hitomi. You understand that everything being discussed here is now sealed under my edict, yes? Hitomi nodded, a serious look on her face. The Hokage's edict was absolute, and she knew that if he suspected she'd divulged Naruto's identity it was possible she could be arrested at best, or simply vanished at worst. Hiruzen stared at her for a second before nodding and turning to Naruto. Is that acceptable, Naruto? It would mean hiding who you are from everyone around you, but it would also prevent the council from making your life unnecessarily difficult, at least for the immediate future. Naruto nodded without hesitation before answering. As long as I can participate as an active part of Konoha's forces, I don't care. If a little deception is what I need to keep some fools from holding me back, I'll do it. Hiruzen nodded. Naruto's true birth certificate and records were already sealed in the Hokage's vault, so it would only take a notation linking Naruto's new identity to those files, and the same secrecy measures would apply to both. If we're going to protect your identity, you'll need a new name. It would do no good to hide your appearance if we don't change that. Any preferences? Hiruzen asked. Naruto thought for a moment, then answered. Kodama. I can shorten Naruto to Ruto, and Kodama is fitting as a last name. Hiruzen could only nod. Naming himself after a forest spirit, I guess it is fitting when you look at his life for the past few years. He certainly managed to imitate one well enough to avoid us for that long. He made the notation to create the false identity, then passed it off to Neko. By the end of the day, Konoha's records would show one Ruto Kodama had been a citizen of Konoha for 7 years, and only access to the Hokage's archive could tell any differently. He stood, and offered his hand to Naruto. Then let me be the first to welcome you to Konoha, Ruto Kodama. May the will of fire burn strongly in you. Naruto hesitated, then shook the proffered hand. Thank you, Hokage-sama, he said quietly. When Naruto walked away from the Hokage's office, he was moderately confident that even Itachi would have had a hard time recognizing him. Inu had gone above and beyond his initial suggestions, providing not only a foundation that completely erased Naruto's whisker marks when applied but also contacts that changed the color of his eyes from blue to a light green and a pair of sunglasses similar to those used by the Aburame clan. A long-sleeved black and red jacket filled out the ensemble, and Ruto Kodama was complete. Being back in the village was something of a culture shock for Naruto, not only due to his long stay in the forest but also the change in the villagers' attitudes towards him. Now that he wasn't the demon brat, shopkeepers called friendly greetings and more than one vendor offered him small samples of their wares. Proprietors that had physically ejected him from their establishments 3 years ago now smiled at him as he passed. It shook him to the core to think of how easy it was to change their attitudes. A jacket and a pair of sunglasses, apply a little makeup and bam. Instant acceptance. Naruto knew deep down that it was an illusion, but he also remembered what Itachi had said. The best illusions are no different from the truth. He repeated to himself. He took a deep breath and let it go explosively. There was no use thinking of how they used to treat Naruto Uzumaki, because from now on there was no Naruto Uzumaki. He was Ruto Kodama, and forgetting that for even an instant could be disastrous. His walk ended at a large apartment building just off of the main commercial district. Konoha was roughly divided into three main sections: residential, commercial, and ninja. The clan compounds were mostly around the ninja sector with the exception of a few clans like the Nara whose clan compound was in the woods off of the commercial district. The Hokage had assigned him an apartment that was at the border between the ninja and commercial districts, citing ease of access to both, and the building was obviously quietly prosperous. He walked up to the second floor and found his room number, the key turning easily in the lock. He knew that Inu lived somewhere in this building from what the Hokage had said, but beyond that he had no idea who any of his neighbors were. The apartment was furnished in a modern but aesthetic style, only 2 chairs at the single table, and a small couch the only other seating in the kitchen and living room. There was a full bathroom, the size of which surprised him, and the bedroom was easily half a dozen times the size of his cubby. Still, he was unused to so much space and the close proximity of other humans. If I hadn't promised Itachi, he thought as he pictured sleeping so close to other humans. He missed the forest more with every passing minute, but he would never go back on his oath to Itachi. Sighing, he fell back on the bed and sunk in slightly. "Well, at least there's something good about this place," he murmured as the soft mattress caused his lids to close slowly. Maybe I could get used to this." His words trailed off, and snoring filled the apartment. He never noticed the door open as a head topped by a shock of white hair peered in, then pulled back and closed the door. Life in Konoha was something Naruto found to be simultaneously endlessly frustrating and endlessly fascinating. Compared to his life in the forest, everything was incredibly fast-paced. Naruto had almost missed more than one appointment simply because he was unfamiliar with any time increment besides sunset, sunrise, noon or midnight. Adjusting to a life measured in seconds and minutes instead of hours and days was frustrating, and Naruto soon began to feel as if every second was something he was losing, slipping through his fingers despite his every attempt to slow them down. Despite his new awareness time, there were several things that he enjoyed in Konoha. Hitomi made a point to visit with him at least once every week or two, and she brought Hinata with her. For Naruto, Hinata's presence was a godsend. While he liked Hitomi, she had a very strong personality, constantly trying to tweak or improve things in Naruto's apartment or suggest new places to visit and activities to try. While Naruto enjoyed new experiences, Hitomi seemed to want to experience a little of everything at the exclusion of deeper enjoyment, while Naruto had long ago learned to appreciate the complexities of the little things. After all, there are only so many opportunities for entertainment in a forest, and being easily bored wasn't really an option if he wanted to stay sane. Hinata was far more timid than her mother, but when Naruto was around she seemed to come out of her shell to some degree. At these times she agreed with Naruto more often than not when it came to choosing what place to eat or activity to try, and as a result they managed to slow down Hitomi's rampage through every new experience to something Naruto could handle without needing to keep a journal just to remember what they'd done in a single afternoon. One thing Naruto had noticed about Hinata was that, if pushed beyond her comfort zone too far or forced out of her timid habits, she showed a determination and force of presence that was truly impressive to the red-haired boy. From his observations while in the forest and the hints Hitomi and Hinata had let slip, he knew that Hinata's relationship with her father was strained due to her kind nature and difficulty with the traditional martial art of her clan. He also knew from his observations that she would practice every day without fail, and rarely if ever complained about any of the treatment heaped upon her. She bore it with a grace that struck a chord in Naruto, reminding him of Itachi's attitude toward his own sacrifice. What Naruto couldn't understand was her lack of skill with an art she worked so hard at. He'd seen her prowess in other areas of the ninja arts, and outside of the Jukin she excelled. It was almost as if the art itself was fighting her. He had considered asking Hitomi more than once, but he wasn't sure if it was a taboo subject, nor was he eager to reveal that he had been spying on the compound even after leaving the woods. For now he was keeping his questions to himself, waiting to see if their enrollment into the academy in 2 months would do something to help with her problems with the Jukin. Naruto wasn't sure what was taught at the academy as Itachi's training had focused on immediately applicable things, not theory, but he assumed that someone there would have an idea about how to approach the situation. In all honesty, Naruto was looking forward to the academy. It was the first step on his path to becoming a strong shinobi like his parents and Itachi, and if he was to ever figure out what had prompted Itachi's actions that night he would need to hone his skills. Sneaking into a place like the Hokage's archives wasn't an activity for an amateur, and despite his growing prowess, Naruto knew he was nowhere near good enough. He could be patient, however. The one thing about the academy that Naruto disliked was the necessity of hiding his heritage. He knew the ruse was necessary to insulate him from the council, but his name was one of the only connections he had to his parents, and it irritated him to have to act as if it didn't exist. His conversation with the Hokage when he'd done the paperwork to enroll in the academy had been heated, to say the least, and not all of it Naruto's fault. 2 days after Naruto's return, Naruto stared at the Hokage over a small pile of forms, his hand aching slightly from all the writing he'd had to do. He'd managed to become somewhat skilled at reading from his stolen scrolls while in the forest, but without any way to practice writing he'd been unable to progress his abilities beyond what he'd had at 4 years old, and even those had atrophied from disuse. The office was once again empty except for the two of them and the Anbu guards Inu and Neko, both of them edging away slowly from the growing confrontation. "I'm sorry, Naruto, but there is no way I can release your inheritance and still maintain your cover," Hiruzen said. "I realize this is difficult, but there's just no way it would go unnoticed." Naruto's stare didn't waver. "I'm not asking for money or recognition. You told me my parents' house is still the same as they left it. Just give me the key." Naruto's voice was even, but internally he was raging at the old man. "I can't, Naruto. If you were seen entering the house," Naruto cut him off swiftly. "The house is on the edge of the village, close to the Uchiha compound. There's never anyone there. How could they see me go into a house they think is abandoned?" he exclaimed angrily. Hiruzen had simply taken a pull on his pipe and exhaled a cloud of smoke. "There are always people around, Naruto. This is a ninja village. It would only take a single mistake and everything would be ruined. I'm sorry, but I cannot risk it." Naruto had stormed out of his office angrily at that, and it had taken him several hours in the forest to calm down. When he finally had a firm hold on his temper, he noticed that he'd unconsciously circled around the village until he was close to the wall that separated the forest from the clan section, not far from his parents' house. Noting the patrolling guards on the walls, he quickly pulled himself over the wall with a quick chain movement and dropped to the ground. He froze, looking for any sign that he'd been seen, but he didn't see or hear anyone. Cautiously making his way over to the front gate, he looked forlornly up at the house. He was less than 15 feet from a tangible relic of his parents, but the ornate gate blocked his way. He could see seals lining the top of the surrounding wall, and recognized a few as variants of explosive seals from Itachi's training. If he tried to jump the wall he'd be lucky to come down on the other side in less than a dozen pieces. He sighed heavily and leaned his head against the gate. So close but so far, his hand rose to touch the handle of the gate lightly, and he nearly jumped out of his sandals as blue light began to climb around the gate. He could see a line of seals radiating out from the lock of the gate, for a brief moment, and then the whole array blinked out as suddenly as it appeared. A loud click came from the lock, and the gate swung inward a few inches. Naruto looked around furtively for a second, but the lure of the house was too much and he pushed his way quickly inside. As the gate closed, Naruto once again saw the array pop up and disappear, another asterisk click signaling the gate was locked again. Naruto walked forward slowly, looking around him. The grounds were unkempt but wide, and he could see a series of posts similar to the ones at the training fields in one corner. The house itself was in good shape, only a little peeling paint betraying the long time it had sat unused. It was not particularly large, only 2 stories. The kind of home a family could grow in without feeling stifled, but not what Naruto would have expected for a Hokage. The front door opened easily at his touch, and he moved into the front hall before closing the door behind him. He could see a hallway stretched out before him, but what caught his attention was the closet next to the door. Several pairs of sandals stood in a small cubby next to the door, and several white coats with flames at the bottom stood in the closet next to a flak jacket. Naruto could feel tears tracking down his cheeks as he looked at the first tangible reminders of his parents that he'd ever seen. He ran a hand slowly over the flak jacket, noting several nicks and a holster for a katana on the back, then took a deep breath. He couldn't stay here forever, and there was more to see. The hallway had several rooms leading off of it that Naruto could see, and a staircase at the other end. He passed a kitchen on his left, dishes still in the sink, but only looked in briefly. The first door on the right side led to a living room with a large fireplace in one wall, a large sheathed katana hanging over the mantel. There were several pictures there as well, and Naruto spent several minutes simply drinking in the sight of his parents. For the first time he had faces to go with the names, and it filled something inside him that he'd never realized was missing. He picked up one picture, a shot of his parents standing arm in arm and a hand each on his mother's pregnant stomach, and took it with him as he moved to explore more. The only other room on the first floor was a bathroom, but the staircase was a spiral that led both upwards and downwards. Deciding to leave the lower level for last, Naruto went up the stairs. The first room was a somewhat bland room that was set up for guests, but the second room was set up as a workshop and armory. Stacks of shuriken and kunai lay on a rack in one corner, and he could see at least 2 katana leaning against the wall. A desk with a long shelf took up one half of the room, ceiling supplies laid out with methodical precision over most of its surface. He could see several tri-pronged kunai sitting on the end of the shelf, and a cursory inspection of the cabinets above the desk showed both more ceiling supplies and a large number of the same strange kunai. He left the room as it was and moved back to the hallway towards the last room on the floor. The door opened to a large bedroom with a west-facing floor-to-ceiling window. The window afforded a beautiful view of the village, and in the waning sunlight Naruto could easily imagine that sunset would look spectacular. The room itself was somewhat messy, showing the hasty nature of its inhabitants' last departure, but it was the corner that made Naruto pause. A large crib stood against the wall, a shuriken and katana mobile hanging over it. Naruto walked slowly over to the crib and stood over it, looking down. A small blanket that looked hand-stitched lay over the bedding, its surface adorned with swirls and leaf symbols. Naruto picked it up with shaking hands and hugged it to his chest. This was where he was supposed to be, happy and safe with his family. Memories of the hatred the villagers had shown him for the first 4 years of his life flashed through his mind, and a deep feeling of loss caused sobs to rack his body. He didn't know how long he sat sobbing next to the crib, but when he finally wiped his eyes and looked up it was dark out. Saying a silent prayer for his parents, he took the slightly tear-stained blanket and wrapped it around the picture he'd grabbed from the living room and headed down the staircase. There was still one part of the house he'd left unexplored, and he didn't know when he would be able to sneak back here again. The Hokage had a point, coming back here too often would increase the chance that he would be found out, and he couldn't afford that right now. The staircase ended at a metal door with the same style lock as the one on the front gate. Naruto tentatively touched the handle and was grateful to see the same seals spread across the door after a second, followed by the asterisk click noise of the lock disengaging. He pushed the door open slowly and moved into the room. Either his presence or the door opening had caused lights to come on automatically, and Naruto looked around him in amazement. Row upon row of scrolls sat in neat racks, filling every corner of the room. He could see several labels from where he stood in the doorway, and they seemed to be elemental labeling. He reached out to the closest rack, one labeled Earth, and took a random scroll. Opening it, he found a series of pictures and instructions that seemed to describe a jutsu for moving underground quickly, complete with handwritten annotations that seemed to be advice on how to make the most of the technique. He put the scroll back on the rack and pulled another from the rack labeled Fire, this time showing a technique for creating a concentrated stream of fire that was breathed out in a straight line. As Naruto looked around he marveled at the concept of such a large collection of ninja techniques. He could stay in here for the next 10 years and barely learn a tenth of the things he could see here. As he marveled at the wealth of information in the room, one scroll caught his eye. The scroll was labeled Shadow Clone Corollaries, and Naruto picked it up eagerly. The Shadow Clone technique was one of his best, and although Itachi had given him another technique that worked off of it, the more options he had the better. A quick glance at the scroll showed 4 techniques, all based off the same theory as the Shadow Clone, starting with the Shadow Shuriken technique. Naruto put the scroll in the same bundle as the picture he'd grabbed, and looked longingly at the room around him. He would love to take more of the scrolls with him, but he knew that there was a limit to how much he could bring with him without being caught. Finally he decided to take only 2 other scrolls, the Earth Move technique and a beginner's guide to sealing, in the hope that he might be able to decode what the seals on the gate were. Naruto resolutely kept his gaze forward as he moved back to the front door, avoiding any more emotional breakdowns like the one upstairs. He stopped only momentarily to glance at the jackets hung in the hall closet before stepping outside, almost running to the front gate. A quick check to make sure that no one was watching, and Naruto opened the gate. Retracing his steps back over the wall was relatively easy, as the village patrols were not very thorough in this peaceful time, and he gained the forest only a few minutes later. He made his way back to the cubby that had been his home before returning to the village. That night he stayed in the forest, staring at the picture of his family. The image followed him into his dreams, and finally the faceless parents that he'd dreamed about so often were fleshed out. That night he'd slept better than he ever had before, protected by the mementos he'd taken. Kakashi stood at the edge of the village walls, looking out over the woods in the direction that Naruto had disappeared. When the Hokage had asked him to follow Naruto after he'd stormed out of the office, Kakashi had reluctantly agreed. Even though he thought it distasteful to keep Naruto away from whatever mementos of his parents still existed, he had agreed with the Hokage that it was too much of a risk for Naruto's cover. He'd been intending to let Naruto run off some of his anger, and then step in and talk to the boy before he did something that would get him into trouble with the old man. His shock when Naruto had walked up to the gates of the Yondaimi's house had almost made him blow his cover when Naruto checked for followers, but it was nothing compared to what he felt when the gates opened at Naruto's touch. Kakashi had been to the house a few times when the Yondaimi was his sensei, and he knew the gates would never open to anyone that didn't possess a blood link to the man. The pieces he hadn't noticed before began to click into place, and when he realized the truth it astonished him that he hadn't seen it before. Sensei's son survived, and we never knew. He thought, his eye widening behind the dog mask. He'd always thought that the child had died the same night the Kyuubi had attacked. That even he, who'd been so close to the previous Hokage, hadn't known about Naruto's parentage was amazing, but the implications for the village as a whole were enormous. The loss of the fourth had been more than a psychological blow for the village. It had signaled the loss of several key techniques that had been unique to the beloved leader. Presumable the scrolls for those techniques existed inside the sealed compound, but even the best seal masters in Konoha had pronounced the seals unbreakable, and cautioned that anyone attempting to tamper with them or cross over the gates would set off a chain reaction that would, at best, obliterate the compound. It was a visible reminder of what Konoha had lost in the Kyuubi attack, sitting here at the edge of the village, taunting them with how close the knowledge was while simultaneously being impossibly far away. With Naruto now having access to the house, it was entirely possible that he would one day return some of the most powerful techniques the world had ever seen to Konoha. Kakashi had stayed hidden outside the house as night began to fall, somewhat worried that one of the security features had caused him some harm. But just when he'd begun toying with the idea of going to the Hokage for help, Naruto stepped back out of the front door and made his way to the gate. Kakashi's eye focused on the bundle in his arms, and he picked out what seemed to be 2 scrolls and something square inside of a handmade blanket. As Naruto ran past his hiding spot, the blanket shifted slightly and he recognized one of the pictures that had been on the mantle the last time he'd been in the house. He knew it was dangerous to have something like that out of the house, much less in Naruto's possession when he was trying to stay incognito, but Kakashi couldn't bring himself to keep Naruto from having at least that much of his parents, not now that Kakashi knew who they were and the magnitude of sacrifice they'd made, leaving their child behind while saving the village. Naruto had moved quickly over the wall and out into the forest, but Kakashi had stayed on the wall watching him disappear between the trees. He had suspected Naruto still had a hideaway somewhere out there, and as much as he wanted to see where it was, even if only to assuage his curiosity after looking for it for so long, he knew it would be a breach of Naruto's privacy. Plus, with Naruto's familiarity with the woods in that area, it would be difficult to hide from the boy, especially in the dark. Kakashi stood on the wall for nearly half an hour before he decided to go back to the Hokage's office. He would tell the old man nothing of this, not until he worked through what he'd learned today, and not unless something Naruto did put him at risk for discovery. He owed his sensei's child that and much more, but it was a start. Free time was something that Naruto had had quite a bit of over the last several years, and would until he started the academy, but he'd learned to fill it with worthwhile things. He'd continued the exercises Itachi had left for him in secret along with the scrolls he'd taken from his parents' house, but recently Inu had taken to training with him in his free time. He'd just shown up one day in the training field Naruto used when he wasn't hanging out with Hitomi and Hinata and begun to critique Naruto on his taijutsu forms. He'd never offered an explanation as to why he would sacrifice his spare time to help Naruto, but every so often Naruto would catch the masked Anbu staring at him intently as he did his exercises. Initially he was wary of Inu, but as several weeks went by without anything bad happening he began to relax around the nearly silent man. When Naruto wasn't training with Inu, he retreated deep into the forest and worked on the scrolls he'd taken from the house. The earth move technique was relatively easy to start, but had taken him several days to perfect to a usable level. His first few tries had been somewhat memorable, with one particularly bad attempt causing him to bang into the roots of several trees when he failed to sink deep enough into the ground, and another attempt nearly causing him to panic when he overpowered the technique and sunk deeper into the ground than he meant to. It took him nearly 5 minutes to claw his way up out of the earth, and he hadn't tried the technique again for nearly a week after that. The scroll with the shadow clone techniques was by far the most interesting to him. The first technique was the shadow shuriken technique, something very similar to how he made shadow clones but targeted toward a thrown kunai or shuriken, and he'd managed to get that down passably. The other 3 techniques, however, were a disaster. The shadow barrier technique wouldn't stay up for more than a fraction of a second, and he still couldn't figure out how to get the other 2 to work at all. The last technique on the scroll had a warning against inexperienced users that Naruto didn't see until he read through it a second time, and his single attempt at the technique had left him gasping on the ground, vision graying out for more than an hour. When he'd finally been able to sit up, he vowed not to work on the technique again until he had more experience and could either figure out the principles behind it or talk to someone who already knew it. The text on ceiling was surprisingly complex, even as a beginner text, but Naruto had been slowly working on it in his spare time. Because there was no visible aspect to it yet, just theory, he could read it in between workouts at his normal training ground, and he'd taken to carrying it with him whenever he went out in the mornings. Naruto had been in the middle of a break 5 weeks after his foray into the house, working through the theory behind basic storage seals when he heard someone coming into the training grounds. As it wasn't one of the normal times for Inu to show up, Naruto looked up warily and quickly put away the ceiling text. His expression quickly shifted from wary to surprised as the sobbing figure of Hinata launched itself at him. He caught her reflexively, unsure what to do about the sobbing girl. "Hinata, what's wrong?" he asked frantically. It took her a second to speak, and Naruto could barely understand her words through the sobs. "Father he. The Jukin, failed." Her disjointed words continued for a minute before tapering off into more sobbing. From what little Naruto had pieced together, her father had been particularly harsh on her as she failed to grasp a basic Jukin technique, and it had finally pushed the gentle girl over the edge. She'd fled the compound, and apparently come out here to find him. Naruto held Hinata awkwardly as she clung to him and sobbed, not knowing what to do. After nearly half an hour her sobs slowly died away and her grip loosened on him, but when he looked down to see if she was done crying he noticed her eyes were closed and her breathing was more even. He frowned slightly at the sight, wondering how he was going to explain this to her family, when 2 more figures came into the clearing. At first he thought the man was Hiyashi, and he felt a surge of irritation at the Hyuga patriarch for his treatment of Hinata, but the soft expression on the man's face and the forehead protector identified him as Hizashi, and his anger abated slowly. Behind him came Hitomi, and for the first time since Naruto had met her she wasn't smiling at all. She had a grim look on her face, and Naruto almost reflexively shrunk back from her slightly. She noticed his reaction, and her face softened slightly as she took in the sight of her daughter sleeping in Naruto's arms. "Thank you for taking care of her, Naruto," she said softly as she came forward to take Hinata from him. "It's been a very hard day for her." Naruto could only nod slightly, and he knew his expression was hard. "It's all right. I just hope she's all right," he said softly. Hitomi didn't respond beyond a sad nod, and she turned to leave the clearing. As Hizashi turned to walk away with her, Naruto called out to him. "Sir," Naruto called, "can I talk to you?" Hizashi hesitated for a moment, looking at Hitomi, but she motioned him towards Naruto and continued to walk out of the clearing. Hizashi walked back to the boy, and looked at him questioningly. Naruto took a deep breath to center himself. He'd made the decision not to pry into Hinata's training when he'd first began hanging out with her and Hitomi, but after today he'd reconsidered. Something was wrong there, and it was hurting his friend severely. "Sir, why does your brother try to force her to do things that don't work?" Naruto asked bluntly. Hisashi's eyes widened fractionally before he responded. "My niece does not grasp the intricacies of the Jukin with the ease my brother would prefer," Hisashi said carefully. Naruto only snorted slightly. "She knows how they work for him, sir. They just don't work for her," Naruto said. It seemed obvious to him after watching Hinata with her father so many times, but apparently it wasn't so clear for others. Hisashi's confused look caused him to sigh. "Watch," he said. A chain extended from his hand to a series of wooden posts lying on the ground at the edge of the clearing and snaked around 3 of them, pulling them towards the boy. Hisashi watched intently as Naruto used his bloodline, and Naruto noticed he'd activated his bloodline at some point. "What is it with Dujutsu users and my chains?" he thought, amused. He planted the posts in a line about 3 feet in front of him, and turned to Hisashi. "This is what you do," he said, and thrust his hand forward. A chain leapt in a straight line from his hand and struck the first post. The spear-tipped chain punched straight through the first post, then the second, and finally struck deeply into the third. Naruto allowed the chain to dissipate, looking intently at Hisashi to see what his reaction was. The older man had furrowed his brows slightly, but still seemed to be giving him the benefit of the doubt. Naruto turned back to the posts. "This is what Hinata does," he said, and thrust his head forward again. This time, instead of striking through the posts with brute force, the chain began to turn. It was very slight, but the movement was enough to cause the chain to avoid the first post, and then curl around the second before implanting itself in the exact same place as the first. Hisashi's brows came up in surprise as he looked at the posts, and he looked at Naruto. "You're saying she's not strong enough to do the Jukin?" he asked skeptically, but Naruto just shook his head. "No, she's not stiff. When you do the Jukin, you're stiff, rigid. She's flexible," he said slowly, trying to find the right words. Hisashi's eyes widened to match his brows for a second, and he looked at Naruto as if seeing him for the first time. "How do you know what I look like when I use Jukin?" he asked. Naruto blushed slightly and looked down. "The walls are shorter than the trees," he mumbled, expecting Hisashi to yell at him. Instead, the white-eyed man just laughed loudly. "Some all-seeing eyes we have," he said depreciatingly. The corner of Naruto's mouth came up in a small smile, glad that Hisashi didn't seem mad that he'd been watching the compound. Hisashi's laughter seemed to die as quickly as it came, and he heaved a large sigh. "I'll look into it, Naruto. I don't know what we'll do if you're right, but if Hinata is truly unsuited to the Jukin, well, we'll figure something out," he said, his voice troubled. Naruto simply nodded to him gratefully. He had worried that Hisashi would simply discard what he was saying because he was younger, but the man seemed to be genuinely considering what Naruto had said. Hisashi nodded back to Naruto, then turned and left the clearing. Naruto stared at the posts for a moment, then down at his tear-stained shirt. Naruto stood outside of the front doors of the academy building where he would be spending much of his time for the next 4 years, and looked at Hinata nervously. She was holding onto Hitomi's hand tightly, and her mother was looking at them both with an amused smile on her face. "It's nothing to be afraid of, you two," she said. "I'm sure you'll learn a lot and make tons of new friends. After all, your future teammates will come from this class," she said brightly, motioning to the other students milling around them. Naruto was feeling nervous about being so close to so many people, but Hitomi and Hinata's presence kept him from bolting. Naruto heard a loud whistle, and looked over to see a man with brown hair and a scar over his nose waving his hand. "Students over here, please. We'll be going through orientation in a minute, so please say your goodbyes and come inside," he yelled out. Hinata looked at her mother, panicking slightly, but Hitomi gave her a hug and a light push towards the door. "You'll be fine," she said. "Besides, you've got Naruto here with you," she said, almost slipping over his cover name. Naruto gave Hinata a nervous smile which she returned, and squared his shoulders. Hitomi surprised him with a quick hug and a murmured, "Good luck," before she stepped back, and the two of them moved forward with the rest of the class. The man, who introduced himself as Iruka, led them into the second classroom on the left of the first floor, and they filed in and began to sit down. Naruto was walking towards the far wall, Hinata right behind him, when he stumbled over the foot of one of the students who had just taken their seat. As he stumbled, he turned slightly and his shoulder banged into the desk, pushing it backwards into the chest of the person he'd tripped over. He stood up quickly and apologized to the boy, who looked at him as if he were something disgusting. Naruto just raised an eyebrow in response, and began walking back toward his intended seats in the upper corner before he heard a muttered, "Freak," from the boy. His eyebrows narrowed in anger at the insult, but Hinata's presence behind him kept him moving forward, but not from glaring at the back of the boy's head when he finally sat down. Iruka began to take roll call, and Naruto heard the boy call out, "Here," when the name, Uchiha Sasuke, was called. Naruto's eyes widened slightly as he realized that this was Itachi's brother. For Naruto, the academy was a series of interesting lessons interspersed between mind-numbingly boring periods of lectures he already knew. Itachi's lessons hadn't been comprehensive, mostly focusing on jutsu theory and combat tactics, but he'd been an exceptionally thorough teacher in the subjects that he'd chosen, and for Naruto that meant that much of the basic theory taught in the academy was already known. He did find the history lessons interesting, and the description of the founding of the village and its 4 Hokages to date had been riveting for the young boy. Iruka had a gift for storytelling, and hearing someone describe his father in such glowing terms brought a warm feeling to his chest. His worst area was, by far, geometry. Itachi had spent a large amount of time honing his instinctive ability to track things in a 3D environment, but he didn't know how he did it, he just did. When Iruka began teaching them how to calculate things like parabolic arcs, Naruto could often get the answers but couldn't show how he got them, and his marks suffered as a consequence. It seemed to frustrate Iruka to no end that Naruto's theoretical knowledge of the subject was so far ahead of his practical knowledge, but to Naruto it seemed a waste of time to try and calculate something he could just feel instinctively, and Iruka gave up after a month of trying. Now he simply ignored Naruto's scores on geometry quizzes except for a little tick in the corner of his forehead, something that secretly amused Naruto to no end. Naruto had, despite his initial misgivings, managed to strike up a tentative friendship with several people in the class, and as a result of her closeness to him, Hinata had been included as well. There were a disproportionate number of clan heirs and heiresses in the group, but for the most part they took Naruto's clan-less status without blinking, possibly because of how close he was to the Hyuga heiress. For her part, although Hinata's stuttering had decreased perceptibly, at least around Naruto, since the time she'd rushed sobbing into the clearing, she was still prone to listening rather than speaking, and it was rare to see her more than a few yards away from Naruto during school hours. The one area that Naruto could honestly say rankled was the class genius, Uchiha Sasuke. At every juncture they seemed to butt heads, and the dark-haired boy's arrogance continually grated on Naruto's nerves. Naruto was sitting at lunch one day 2 months into the semester watching the Uchiha being fawned over by several of his local fangirl contingent when he felt someone sit next to him. He turned slightly to see the Aburame heir, glasses in place, nod towards the Uchiha heir slightly. "Not unlike the reaction of bees to a blooming flower, is it not?" he said in a low voice. Naruto snorted at the image of the arrogant boy as a blooming flower, but couldn't deny the similarities. "Closer to moths drawn to a flame. Bees get nectar from the flowers they find, right?" Naruto said. He vividly remembered the one time he'd tried to take honey from a beehive while he was living in the forest. It turned out that chains were wholly ineffective against angry bees, and he'd never tried again. Shino's eyebrows raised slightly in what Naruto had come to recognize as his version of a smile at the comment, and he could hear a delicate giggle from Hinata on his other side. The Aburame heir had been the first person to befriend Naruto, possibly because he was the only other person wearing glasses in class, and his stoic presence had been a balm to Naruto in the face of the simpering fangirls that seemed to make up so much of the female populace. Naruto had quickly found out that Shino, while normally quite a literal speaker, had a cutting sense of humor when he chose to exercise it. The Uchiha heir had offhandedly insulted his bugs during the first week of class, and Naruto was beginning to realize that while Shino was normally unflappable, he did not like it when somebody insulted his clan or their insects. He still wasn't sure exactly how Shino had managed to get bugs inside Sasuke's sealed lunchbox, but the look on the Uchiha's face had given him pleasant dreams for several days. Since that day, Sasuke had been conspicuously avoiding the Aburame heir during class, and when they were paired up for exercises, Naruto had noticed that Shino seemed to let his insects swarm more than usual, unnerving his opponent. Indeed they do, and from it they make honey, the stoic bug user replied. Which begs the question. Why do they swarm to him? Naruto just shrugged nonchalantly, used to their behavior by now, even if it still baffled him. Iruka opened the doors leading out to the yard where all the academy students were sitting and motioned them back inside, and Naruto stood up eagerly. After weeks and weeks of lectures on the theory behind the basic jutsu at the academy, they were finally working on actually performing the techniques they would one day need to pass and become full shinobi. Naruto had, of course, learned all three of the basic academy jutsu from his time with Itachi, but it was the chance to show up the arrogant Uchiha that really had him excited. He had something special planned for the today, and he couldn't wait to see the look on Sasuke's face. They filed quickly into the classroom as Iruka began to lecture about the exercise, a basic one involving the use of a kawurimi to avoid a blunted kunai. The students were put in pairs, one person throwing the kunai and the other substituting, before switching. Each group would then randomize to give the substituting student a wide range of different kunai throwing experiences, hopefully increasing their ability to use the technique in the field more effectively. Naruto was initially paired up with Hinata, but was exasperated when she had trouble bringing herself to attack him. Come on, Hinata, it's just a blunted kunai, it's not like it'll do any damage if it hits, he cajoled. Though the last few months had been good for Hinata's confidence, although whether it was the academy itself or just the time away from her demanding father, Naruto didn't know, she was still reluctant to hurt anyone, even in a training exercise, and that tendency seemed to be greatest when it came to Naruto. Hinata looked down at the kunai in her hands for a moment, and then took a deep breath. Her aim was perfect, and Naruto couldn't help but smile as he made the hand signs for the kawurimi and felt the familiar tugging sensation as he switched places with a nearby log. As he walked back over to Hinata, he could see her eyes moving over him and checking for injuries. "See, I told you. Not a mark on me," Naruto said softly, watching as Hinata looked down with a slight blush. The signal came for them to change partners, and Naruto leaned forward to lightly squeeze her shoulder in reassurance before moving to stand in front of Shino. He made a subtle, "come here," motion with his hand and Shino leaned forward. "I need a favor," Naruto began, and quickly outlined his plan. The bug user froze for a moment as he finished, and then Naruto witnessed something he'd never thought was possible. He laughed. I didn't even know he could laugh. Naruto thought in shock. While the collar of Shino's dark jacket hid his mouth, the evil tone of his laughter made Naruto sure the boy was smiling widely. Naruto shook himself visibly, and then fell back into position. He spared a quick look at Sasuke, who was acting as a kunai thrower at the moment, and nodded at Shino. Shino raised both arms towards Naruto, but instead of a kunai there was a large dark mass of bugs flying out towards him. He waited until the bugs were almost upon him and then made a hand sign, smirking the entire time. He felt the jutsu take hold just as the bugs obscured his vision, and was suddenly staring at Sasuke's partner. He quickly looked towards the area he'd been with Shino moments before and saw Sasuke, eyes wide in shock, appear in his place. The Kikai bugs that had been about to cover Naruto instead coated Sasuke from head to toe until the black-haired boy was completely obscured. There was a moment of absolute silence and shock, and then Sasuke began to scream. "I'll get them off, get them off, get them off!" he yelled, panicking and spinning around in an attempt to dislodge the swarming insects. Naruto watched as Shino waited for a few seconds to get the maximum enjoyment out of the scene, and then the bug user began to pull the swarm back towards his body and off of the Uchiha. Sasuke, seeing the entire swarm congealing in one place, immediately began to make hand signs, his face murderous. He took a deep breath, aimed his face towards the swarm and exhaled a head-sized fireball towards the black cloud. Naruto had a split-second realization as soon as the fireball came into existence as he noticed that the swarm was directly between Sasuke and Shino, placing his friend in the direct path of the oncoming fire jutsu. Acting on instinct, he made a quick hand sign and felt the pull of the kawurimi take hold, switching him with Shino as the fireball roared through the cloud of bugs and continued onwards. Naruto had only moments before the fireball would be on him, and a quick glance told him that dodging would not get him far enough away to avoid injury. He squared his shoulders as he faced the inferno arm extended, focusing all of the chakra he could into his hand. A single chain quickly extended from his palm, sprouting successively longer side chains from each link until the entire length looked akin to a drill. He could almost feel the chain as it hit the fire jutsu and split it in half, and as soon as he saw the two halves begin to travel away from each other he dissolved the chain, hoping no one had seen him use his Kekkei Genkai. Naruto took a moment to collect himself, absently noting that Shino looked unharmed but slightly dazed, and turned to Sasuke. The boy's chest was heaving as he bent over, trying to recover from both the unexpected Kawarimi and the fire jutsu, and he didn't look up as Naruto stalked over to him. He grabbed Sasuke by the collar of his shirt and pulled him up face to face. "Are you insane?" Naruto shouted angrily at the other boy, his face red. "You could have killed someone with that fireball, what were you thinking?" Sasuke looked shocked for a moment as he stared at Naruto before his mind kicked back into full gear, and he roughly shoved the other boy away from him. "Never lay hands on me, Dobi. Someone like you doesn't deserve the privilege." His voice was condescending, and Naruto felt his anger grow at the casual dismissal. He could hear Sasuke's fan club in the background yelling at him for laying hands on the Uchiha, but he ignored them as he focused on the boy. "Trust me, the last thing I want to do is be anywhere near you, Uchiha, but your stupidity nearly got Shino killed. Do you have any idea how close you came to hitting him?" Naruto repeated, somewhat amazed at the level of arrogance the dark-haired boy was showing. "He shouldn't have put his disgusting bugs near me if he didn't want to get burned," Sasuke stated, looking quickly at Shino. Naruto noticed his lip curl with disgust as he looked at the bug user and his self-control snapped. He brought his fist back to swing at Sasuke, only to feel another hand gripping his arm. A quick glance showed him a frowning Iruka looking from Sasuke to Naruto, and he let his arm fall limp. Iruka let go of his arm, but turned to glare at both of them. "Ruto, no fighting in class," he said, causing Sasuke to smirk before he turned to the other boy. "And Sasuke, the next time you use an elemental combat jutsu in my class I'll kick you out." Ruto was right, you could have killed someone over a small prank. Iruka rebuked, his face angry. Sasuke looked shocked for a moment, then his normal scowl returned stronger than ever. He didn't bother to respond to the teacher, instead choosing to walk away. Iruka sighed and turned to Naruto. "Did you have to set him off?" he asked plaintively. "It was a harmless prank, and he was out of line with that jutsu," Naruto retorted. Iruka just shook his head but let the subject drop. He couldn't argue that Sasuke's response had been excessive, but everything to do with the last Uchiha was a pain in the ass involving the council, something Iruka wanted to avoid if at all possible. Naruto watched as Iruka called the rest of the class over and sent them home for the day, but couldn't bring himself to talk to Shino. He felt guilty over what had happened, and was worried that his friend might blame him for causing Sasuke's reaction. More than once he'd seen the bond Shino had with his Kekkei bugs, and his prank on Sasuke had ended with a large number of Shino's insects destroyed, something he was sure the other boy would be displeased about, so he avoided him until he left the academy. He decided that he was too keyed up to go straight home, and since the academy had been let out early he headed for his normal training grounds. He'd been at the grounds for about an hour practicing dodging shuriken by sinking into the ground with the Mogaragakure no Jutsu, hiding like a mole, when he noticed a man walk into the clearing. He quickly cancelled the clone he was practicing with, and turned to the stranger as he walked over. Naruto felt a wave of dread pass over him as he saw a man that looked like an older version of Shino, from what little he could see that wasn't covered up, walking towards him. "They're probably here because of what happened with Sasuke," he thought pensively. He'd been sure Shino was unhappy with him for getting the colony roasted, but didn't think it would cause enough trouble to involve the clan head. He quickly stood up straight and bowed as the man came closer, thankful for the tips that Hitomi had given him about etiquette during some of their lunch excursions. "Hello Aburame-sama," he said respectfully. The older man stopped several feet from Naruto and, much to his surprise, dipped his head into a shallow bow. "Kodama-san, my son has informed me of an altercation that occurred at the academy today between the two of you and the Uchiha heir." His voice was reminiscent of Shino's, flat and with a slight buzzing undertone. Naruto's face flushed guiltily at the blunt statement. "Yes sir, I'm sorry. It was supposed to be a small prank, I never meant, I mean, I'm sorry." He stuttered out nervously. The other man's eyebrows raised slightly as he rambled out the apology. I believe that you have the wrong assumption about my purpose here, Kodama-san, he said slowly. Shino informed me that it was only your timely use of the kawarimi that prevented him from being severely injured by a misused fire jutsu. Naruto froze as he looked up at the Aburame clan head, and tried to switch gears away from panicked apology. I am here to extend to you the thanks of the Aburame clan for protecting my son, the man continued. Should you ever need the aid of the Aburame clan, you have but to ask, he finished. Naruto stared at him dumbly for a moment, nodding and thanking him. His task completed, Shino's father turned without another word and walked out of the clearing, leaving an incredibly confused Naruto in his wake, trying to figure out what had just happened. It took Naruto several minutes to reboot his overtaxed brain, and as he finally shook himself from his daze, he immediately set out towards his apartment. That was hands down the strangest thing that's happened to me in a while, he thought as he made his way home, his distraction ensuring that he failed to notice the figure hidden in the branches of one of the trees surrounding the clearing. Moments after the boy left the training ground, the figure turned and disappeared into the forest, only the flash of a red cloud giving any clue to his presence as he ran to meet his contact. Itachi wasn't entirely sure what to make of his partner. Hoshigaki Kisame was definitely a skilled ninja, and somewhat easy to work with, but Itachi had never met anyone quite so happy. All the time. It was actually somewhat unnerving, even for the normally stoic Uchiha. They had been partnered up not long after his induction into Akatsuki, their leaders taking his massacre of the Uchiha clan as proof of Itachi's traitor status, and in that entire time Itachi had not seen the man stop smiling even once. That wouldn't be so bad if he didn't have shark teeth, Itachi mused. They were sitting outside a small food stand in a small crossroads hamlet not far from the border between the fire and rain countries as they waited for an informant from Konoha, dressed as traveling monks. He's late. I wonder if we should break him, just a little. It would show the others to make their rendezvous on time, Kisame said cheerfully, his words at odds with his tone. It wouldn't even have to hurt that much, I could just feed some of his chakra to Samahata as a warning. Itachi sighed and spoke in a resigned voice. Kisame, that is your response to everything. If we damage our informants, we will soon find ourselves without any informants, you know this. This was their third time meeting an Akatsuki informant since Itachi had joined, and each time Kisame had found a reason to suggest that they play with them. Kisame sighed and looked at Itachi, his shark-like teeth glinting. You always say that, Itachi. You know, if you lightened up once in a while you'd get much more enjoyment from life. Life is meant to be lived, not endured, he finished jubilantly, ignoring Itachi's deadpan look. Oh look, the chum's here, Kisame motioned with his head, and Itachi saw their informant walk into the hamlet from the front. Itachi frowned at the informant's lack of vigilance when his eyes caught a figure following the man in the distance. Kisame, our friend seems to have been lax with his attempts at remaining covert. Would you rather take care of it or should I? Kisame's looked quickly behind the approaching informant and his eyes narrowed. His smile widened and took on a predatory quality. Samahata is hungry. You play with the chum, I'm going to go catch some prey, he said, and calmly walked into the shadow of a nearby building before vanishing in a swirl of water. Itachi turned to the informant as he walked to the stand and stood next to him. You're late, and you were followed, Itachi said, allowing an undercurrent of annoyance at the man's incompetence to creep into his voice. The informant jerked slightly, then turned to Itachi. My associate is taking care of him. Your information, Itachi said coldly, and grabbed the packet the man handed him. He leafed through it quickly, seeing the normal reports of financial activities and council politics, then stopped on a picture. He ruthlessly suppressed his shock before turning to the informant. Who is this? He asked. The nervously sweating informant rushed to answer. The Kyuubi Jinchuriki, sir. I found him. Itachi noted the undercurrent of pride in the man's voice, and stared him in the eyes. He watched the informant's eyes widen as he noticed the activated Sharingan, and waited a moment before he spoke again. The identity of the Kyuubi Jinchuriki has been a mystery since its attack on Konoha. How is it that you've deduced it now? Did the boy use its chakra? He asked. He had to find out quickly before he could act, and was thankful for once for Kisame's habit of playing with his food. No, but I saw the seal on his body and sensed the chakra underlying his own. My family may not have as many clan techniques as the Inuzuka, but our sensing techniques are better. He smells like the fox, and I would swear on my life that I sensed the fox's chakra underneath the boys." He spoke quickly, as if trying to ward off Itachi's ire with the sheer speed of his speech. Itachi stared at the man for several moments, internally debating, and then came to a decision. "You've done well," he said, throwing him the pouch of coins they'd agreed upon for his service. "One last thing," Itachi said, causing the man to look up. He caught the informant's gaze with his Sharingan, Kama's spinning quickly, and layered a genjutsu over his mind. "You never saw the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. The Kyuubi Jinchuriki is not in Konoha. This boy," he held up the picture of Naruto training in a clearing, "has no connection to the Kyuubi, and you will stay away from him," Itachi finished. The man blinked several times. "If we have no more business?" Itachi said, his eyebrow arching. The informant looked down at the pouch in his hands and shook his head quickly. Itachi turned and walked away from the stand in the direction the informant had come from, watching for Kisami's chakra with his Sharingan. He found his partner almost a mile off of the road in a copse of trees. The shark man was grinning as usual, and Itachi spared a glance at the body next to him. The Konoha shinobi wasn't familiar, just someone he vaguely thought might have been part of the Sarutobi clan, but he acknowledged that there was no way to prevent the man's death. Kisame would have noticed their watcher only seconds after Itachi did, and the man's sacrifice had further cemented his position with Kisame. "Anything interesting?" Itachi shook his head. "Just the usual reports. He didn't know he was being followed, so I let him live," Itachi said. "If you're done?" He inclined his head towards the body. Of course. Though he was barely an appetizer, Samahata's scales rustled at that, as if in agreement. Without acknowledging that last statement, Itachi set off towards the road. When they reached the main thoroughfare, he tossed the packet to Kisame, who began looking through it, never noticing the missing pages. Hisashi walked into his brother's office and stood in front of the desk, ignoring the somewhat irritated look that was shot his way. "What is it, Hisashi?" Hisashi asked. "You can't keep doing this, Hisashi." Hisashi said, still evident in his normally cheerful voice. "You've tested her 4 separate times and it always comes out the same. Hinata has the water affinity, and trying to force her into traditional Jukin is never going to work the way you want it to." He watched as his brother's face grew harder with every word, but he refused to back down on this. Ever since he'd tested Hinata's elemental affinity after his conversation with Naruto, his brother had been digging his feet in harder and harder when it came to Hinata's training, and the punishments for failure he was meting out were becoming borderline abusive. "I've told you before, Hisashi, her affinity isn't the issue. If she tried hard enough she could become proficient in the Jukin. After all, I was able to." Hisashi fired back, his tone angry. Hisashi looked at his brother incredulously. Does he truly not see how unsuited for the Jukin she is? He wondered. "Hisashi, your water affinity was secondary and weak. Hinata's water affinity is one of the strongest I've ever seen, and she has no affinity for earth. At best her second affinity could be lightning, but forcing her into an earth-based style is torture. She isn't lacking proficiency because she's lazy, she's lacking proficiency because the style fights her at every step. You'd be better off training someone without the Byakugan in the Jukin than your daughter," he said angrily. "If you'd just let me retrieve the Ryudokan scrolls from the archives." He barely saw his brother move before he was pinned to the wall, his collar bunched in Hiyashi's grip. "I decide what is best for my daughter, brother. You have no say in how my family or this clan is run, and my daughter will learn the Jukin or she will be replaced." Hisashi spit out viciously. Hisashi couldn't respond with his brother's hands at his throat, but after a moment Hisashi let him go. He dropped to the floor as his brother spun away and moved back to the desk, ignoring him. As he pulled himself shakily to his feet and stepped to the doorway, he looked back, but his brother never looked up. "One day your attitude is going to come back to haunt you, Hisashi. I just hope we don't all pay the price for it," he thought sadly as he walked out and closed the door. Itachi sat alone at a table in one of the seedier bars in the capital of the rice country and contemplated the drink in front of him. He habitually avoided alcohol, preferring not to cloud his senses and dull his mind, but sitting in a bar without a drink would draw attention. He didn't move as someone slid into the booth across from him, rather choosing to mimic taking a small sip from the cup in front of him. "You actually drink that swill?" his new companion asked, grimacing. Itachi simply tilted the cup towards him, showing that it was still almost full. Probably a smart idea. Knowing this place, it's probably more rainwater than sake anyways. The man laughed at his own joke, ignoring Itachi's unchanging expression. So what have you got for me? He asked jovially. Not much change, Itachi responded, ignoring the attempts at levity. We're mostly doing mercenary work for now, building capital. I'm not sure for what, but considering the number of S-ranked missions we've taken on, the amount of capital we've earned is substantial, at least 15 or 16 million, and they show no signs of stopping. His contact nodded, writing down the information on a small pad. And the other goal? He asked. Just surveillance for now. They're not going after any of the containers for some reason. Most of them are content to just follow orders and rack up money for now, but I doubt anyone but the leader has any idea about the ultimate goal. Itachi told him in a low voice, his lips barely moving. He hesitated a moment and then continued. There was a breach, he said, noticing his contact stiffen. One of the informants found out the Kyuubi's location. I took care of it, but you should know they don't buy that the Yondaime killed it. Itachi reached into his coat and pulled out the pages he'd removed from the packet on Konoha. He put them on the table and watched as the other man read through them quickly. Damn, you're sure you plugged the leak? Itachi nodded and the other man sighed. I'll let them know they need to step up the patrols around the village, he said, and then hid the papers inside his own bag. I need to get going. Spy networks don't run themselves and all that, he said as he stood up, his long white hair swaying behind him. You know where the next meet is? He asked Itachi, who simply nodded again. Well then, good luck. With that he walked out the front door of the bar, leaving Itachi with his thoughts. Naruto struggled to pull himself to his feet, panting after taking a strong kick to the stomach. 10 yards away Inu was making short work of a half-dozen of his cage bushin, dodging their chain attacks and casually redirecting them so that they his other clones as they missed. In the 15 seconds or so that it took Naruto to get his breath back after being hit, his dozen clones were cut, stabbed, clubbed, or otherwise demolished. Naruto winced slightly as the memories of their defeat flowed back into him. He'd been sparring with Inu for the better part of 20 minutes and had yet to make the Anbus so much as breath heavily. Originally he had been going for non-lethal tactics, afraid of hurting his training partner, but as the spar had gone on he'd upgraded once it became clear that anything less than his best would be completely useless against the older ninja. Not that his best was doing much better, but at least he was getting some good experience out of it. Naruto made a quick sign and another dozen cage bushin popped into existence around him, and he switched places with one of the newly created clones while the smoke was still obscuring Inu's vision in order to hide his true position. He'd quickly learned that a frontal assault was useless, and had been trying to surround and flank his target in order to increase his chances. He and his clones spread out around Inu in a circle, the Anbu appearing to watch them all simultaneously, although it was hard to tell with the mask. At an unseen signal half of the clones rushed in towards Inu, and the other half immediately sent a series of chains towards their target in support. He'd tried this strategy twice before with no results, but this time he had a plan. He smiled as the first clones reached Inu. Let's see how you deal with this. Kakashi casually dodged one clone's jab and ducked under an incoming chain while chopping its neck, dispelling it, and looked up to see several more chains coming towards him. He frowned slightly at the tactic, disappointed that Naruto would continue to try something that had already failed twice. It was something he'd rarely seen, as the boy was normally quick to improvise, even if some of his improvisations were downright crazy. The first wave of chains retracted as he dispelled another clone, and then shot forward for a second go, just like the other 2 times. Maybe he's having an off day? Kakashi wondered before he caught the outer ring of clones, the chain users, making a series of hand signs. Shuriken cage bushin? But I don't see any shuriken too. Crap, he thought as the incoming chains began to multiply. The full length of the chain wasn't replicated, only the last foot or so, but as that was the spear-tipped portion he was immediately inundated with a hail of spear-tipped chains. Worse, as there were multiple real chains mixed in, a simple Doden wall would be unable to stop them all. Signing quickly, Kakashi drew a large measure of chakra into his lungs and exhaled heavily. The chakra turned the air in his lungs into a disproportionately large amount of water that formed into the visage of a dragon as it came from his throat. The Suiryuden no Jutsu curled around him protectively for a moment then whipped around him quickly. The chakra-infused water blew away the incoming chains and the closest clones before moving in a circle out to the outer layer of clones. As the water cleared, it left a heavily breathing Kakashi behind, unable to believe that he'd been forced to use a B-rank jutsu to fend off an academy student. He looked around quickly for Naruto before he noticed the still form of his opponent lying where the outer ring of clones had been. The Hokage's going to be pissed, he thought as he ran to check on the boy. When Naruto opened his eyes, he was greeted by the sight of the same dank tunnel that he'd seen several years before after he'd been stabbed rescuing Hinata. He wearily pulled his body to his feet and started off down the tunnel, wondering what had happened to send him here. The last thing he remembered was trying to catch Inu off guard with his Cage Fusa technique. He was very proud of the modifications he'd made: the Cage Shuriken, temporarily modifying his chains to mimic what he'd done to the Kumo shinobi, but if Inu's reaction was anything to go by, his pride was probably justified. Naruto walked up to the same bars he'd seen last time, and just like before, the giant eye opened before the rest of the Kyuubi came into view. "I was wondering when I would see you again, kid," the demon rumbled. "What made you think I would come back here?" Naruto asked, his voice skeptical. "You have a habit of pissing people off, and not always people weaker than you. I knew sooner or later you'd bite off more than you could chew, and it looks like I was right. Maybe you should look into more defensive techniques than offensive if you're going to keep standing in the line of fire of powerful jutsu." The fox chuckled as he looked at Naruto, whose face was turning red as he was reminded of Inu's response to his Cage Fusa. "It's not like I stand in front of them on purpose, furball." Naruto had to jump back immediately as several giant claws gauged the ground he'd been standing on. "Respect, kid. I may be jailed in here, but you should still show your superiors the respect they deserve," the Kyuubi growled out angrily. Naruto opened his mouth to argue, but closed it when he considered his situation. He was stuck inside, wherever this was with the Kyuubi, and he wasn't 100% sure that the seal would hold if the demon got angry enough. "So am I going to end up here every time I get knocked out? Because, not that you're not interesting and all, but that would be annoying," Naruto said after a pause to look around. "Plus this place is kind of a dump." For some reason the Kyuubi began laughing as he said that. "This dump is your mind, kid." It managed to get out between laughs. Naruto scowled at him. "What do you mean this is my mind? There's no way my mind is this damp," Naruto said angrily. "It's a representation inside your mind. If you concentrate, you can change it," the Kyuubi said. Naruto stared at it doubtfully. "Try it if you don't believe me. You could make it anything you want, any place you can think of. Even that clearing you're so fond of." Naruto looked at the Kyuubi for a moment, then at the dank sewer around him. "If I've gotta be here," he thought, and then pictured the clearing he'd just been in. He concentrated on the image as hard as he could, closing his eyes to block out any distractions, and only stopped when he heard the Kyuubi laughing evilly. "Freedom!" it shouted, and Naruto suddenly noticed that he'd failed to include the Kyuubi's prison in his new image. He looked at the giant fox fearfully and turned to run. Before he could move more than a couple of steps, the Kyuubi threw itself forward, jaws open. Just when Naruto was sure he would end up as Fox Kibble, there was a large shimmer in the air, and the same bars that held the Kyuubi away from him in the dank tunnel flared into being between the Kyuubi and Naruto. The fox hit the bars with a resounding crash and bounced off, a surprised look on the vulpine face. As soon as the fox was more than a few feet from the bars, they disappeared, but as soon as the fox tried to charge Naruto again, they reappeared. Finally the fox simply sat several yards away from Naruto, his slit pupil eyes watching. Naruto slowly pulled himself up, and stared at the fox accusingly. "You tricked me." The fox simply raised one eyebrow. "I tried to trick you. And it's not like you can blame me. I was stuck in that dank pit for over half a decade. You'd do the same," it said in a conversational tone. It disturbed Naruto how easily the being could switch from bloodthirsty animal to calm conversationalist. "I can definitely blame you. You tried to eat me," Naruto accused. "You're my jailer, and your death would free me. I had a chance and I took it." The calm way the Kyuubi was talking about his death was starting to get to Naruto. "Maybe I should put you back in that dank cell," Naruto said, beginning to grow angry as the adrenaline from his near death wore off. The Kyuubi simply smiled. "Maybe you should. But you're forgetting something, kid." The smile grew impossibly wide. "I brought you here." The Kyuubi blew out a huge breath, and Naruto felt a tug as he was pulled from the Kyuubi's prison. After the Kyuubi had ejected Naruto from the mindscape, it looked around at the new surroundings. "Not bad," it said in a satisfied tone, and moved cautiously towards the bars that had appeared before. Without Naruto around, the bars failed to appear, and the Kyuubi moved off into the woods surrounding the clearing, eager to stretch its legs after so long in captivity. Naruto woke up coughing just in time for Inu to slap him in the face again. "Wake up, kid," the Anbu said, shaking him roughly. As soon as Naruto's eyes opened, the shaking stopped. "Oh, thank Kami," Inu breathed, relieved. "I thought you'd drowned." Naruto glared at him. "Maybe if you didn't try to drop a lake on me I wouldn't have almost drowned." Inu looked sheepish, or at least as sheepish as you could behind a full face mask. Well, best 2 out of 3? He asked, causing Naruto to groan. His entire body felt like one giant bruise, and whatever he'd done to change the fox's prison had exhausted him even more. He just shook his head at Inu and stood shakily. "No thank you. I need a hot bath and some sleep," he said, and Inu grabbed his arm to steady him. "Maybe next time," Inu said, laughter underlying his voice, but Naruto just snorted. It took them almost 30 minutes to cover what was normally a 15-minute walk back to the apartment block, but the bath at the end was worth it. Naruto could swear he felt his muscles unclench one by one as he sank into the hot water, and he vowed that the next time Inu sparred with him he would find a way to get back at him for how beat up he felt. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.